here in support of Sustainable Development Goal 7, which invited African energy ministers from developing countries to meet with some of the expertise that we have here in the UK in terms of renewable energy.
Michael Fabricant.
Solar energy is a relatively clean way of generating electricity. What steps are we actually taking in Africa to help those people who are not only off-grid, but those on-grid too?
Well, he's absolutely right that solar energy, particularly in sunny places, is a very good idea. And indeed, there's some very windy coastline where wind energy, offshore wind energy, would be very helpful. So in addition to the event that we held for African energy ministers the week before last, I can assure the honourable gentleman that we've come up with some remarkable inventions using some of our overseas development assistance. For example, a solar-powered fridge.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Speaker, could the Minister outline the steps the Department is taking to improve and enhance biodiversity and habitat enhancement, particularly the recent investment into the Darwin Fund?
Well, she will be glad to know that I work very closely with my counterpart at the Department for the Environment and also with my counterpart in BEIS to work to join up the work that we are doing in terms of tackling biodiversity, specifically the contribution that we've made to the Global Environment Fund.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mangrove forests are one of the most effective habitats at storing carbon dioxide that might otherwise be released. What's the government doing to help reduce mangrove forest loss?
Minister.
Yes, we've rebranded them blue forests, and we think that they're incredibly important, not only as a way of storing carbon, but recently it was proven that they also improve resilience towards cyclones. And so I think they're an important part of the work and have been championed vigorously by my honourable friend, the member for Suffolk Coastal.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, on the same day that 1.4 million children went on climate strike across the world, over 1,000 people were killed in Mozambique and Zimbabwe during Cyclone Idai. Does the Secretary of State agree that young people and those living in the developing world are the least responsible and yet will bear the greatest brunt of the climate crisis? And if so, does she agree the UK government must make climate justice a key part of its climate change strategy?
Well, this is indeed exactly the reason why the UK is proud to be stepping up our work in terms of international climate finance and that we've committed £5.8 billion to work with some of the poorer countries in the world, including the countries affected by this particular cyclone in Mozambique. There will be an urgent question later where I'll be able to elaborate more on the work that the UK has been able to provide to help with the situation there.
Gill.
Mr. Speaker, our thoughts are with all those affected by the devastation of Cyclone Idai across Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi. And I would like to share with the House the thoughts of Annabelle Lemos.
Order. A lot of very noisy private conversations taking place. Order. It's rather discourteous to the member of the opposition front bench who's highlighting very, very grave matters. Preet Kaur Gill.
Mr. Speaker, our thoughts are with all those affected by the devastation of Cyclone Idai across Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi. And I would like to share with the House the thoughts of Annabella Lemos, a woman at the forefront of the climate justice movement in Mozambique. And she says, the people of Mozambique need emergency response and support right now to survive this crisis. But this is also a harsh reminder that the climate crisis is upon us and developed countries need to urgently reduce their emissions and stop funding fossil fuels. I welcome the relief package for the region issued by DFID, but it is a tragic irony of climate change and that those least responsible are the ones who pay the highest price. A key component of the 2015...
Order. No, I'm sorry. This simply isn't on. I'm sorry. I don't wish to be unkind to the Honourable Lady. I need a sentence with... No, one sentence with a question mark at the end of it. My apologies for interrupting, but it's far too long. Sorry. Preet Kaur Gill.
Will the Minister confirm if the Government has plans to offer any additional climate finance to support vulnerable communities and countries to cope with the consequences of climate change?
Minister.
Well, I can confirm that we are already committed to spending £5.8 billion over this spending period, and that will involve us being able to increase our finance over the course of the next spending review period. And I do want to highlight, we will have an urgent question in a moment to talk about the specific situation in Mozambique, but the report from ICAI recently said that UK international climate finance is showing a very convincing approach and with some very good emerging results in terms of influencing others, and we aim to continue with that work.
Well, topical questions. David T.C. Davis.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in expressing our concern at the loss and devastation following the deadly cyclone in southern Africa. In Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe, hundreds have lost their lives, many more their homes. We pre-deployed aid, and the first UK relief flight arrived in Mozambique yesterday, delivering family tents, shelter kits for those forced to flee their homes. In Malawi, we are working with the World Food Programme to enable 140,000 people to access food. And in Zimbabwe, we are working with our partners to provide hygiene kits and essential medicines.
David T.C. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend for the aid which is being sent to Venezuela, whose people are facing horrendous shortages of food, electricity and medical supplies. But does she agree that as well as sending aid, we need to send a message from all sides of this House that the failed, hard-left socialist policies being pursued by that government will always lead to economic ruin wherever they are applied?
Well, this is a tragic situation. It is a man-made crisis, and we are doing everything we can to support, through the Lima Group, the response there. But he is right, and it is why it is important that we remember that keeping economies strong is absolutely vital for human capital, for the basics in life, and we must never ever let systems which don't support that take hold.
I'm sorry, we've got to move on. Laura Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On her recent visit to Bangladesh, did the Secretary of State discuss concerns about relocating refugees to Bazan Char with the authorities?
Yes, I did do that. We looked at what they were doing with the island, and we have expressed concerns about that. Also, that there are many more people. The island will only take 100,000 that need to be taken care of in this protracted crisis.
Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ellington Junior School are on a mission to make the world clear of minefields left behind after wars, and I have committed to help them. I thank the Minister for her written answers she has given me so far, and would ask that the Government is doing what they are doing to persuade the 5 countries in receipt of UK aid who are not yet signed up to the Ottawa Convention to do so.
Mr. Speaker, can I firstly congratulate Ellington Junior School for their work in joining the Department's mission to help save the world from landmines, and they're joining leading UK NGOs like Mine Advisory Group and Halo Trust, which do fantastic work in this space. We constantly go to those who are not yet signed up to the Ottawa Convention to do so, and I hope that the Honourable Lady will take even further interest in this and maybe do some visiting as I've done in the past.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Save the Children Fund have identified 5 things that this government can do to help end the conflict in Yemen. Will the government do them?
Mr. Speaker, last week I held a telephone conference call with Lisa Ground, the UN coordinator of Yemen, with a number of UN agencies. We're looking at everything we can do. This morning I met with humanitarian workers, women workers from Yemen themselves. We will, of course, work even more closely with all our partners there and support UNICEF in all its work.
Scott Mann.
You're asked, Mr. Speaker, what is the department doing to support the people of Zimbabwe, Mozambique and Malawi after the recent cyclone?
Minister.
Well, he will be aware that yesterday we were able to announce a further £6 million of emergency funding, working with our partners like UNICEF, the World Food Programme and others on the ground. We were also able to pre-position aid, and I know that Mr. Speaker has kindly allowed an urgent question on this subject following Prime Minister's questions.
Helen Hayes.
you, Mr. Speaker. At the International Labour Organisation Convention in June on ending violence and harassment in the world of work, will the Secretary of State commit on behalf of the UK to negotiate for protection for all workers, including those working in domestic and informal settings? And will she undertake any attempts to resist any attempts to water down or reduce the scope of the agreement?
Well, both in terms of the work that we do through the ILO, but also some new work that we're doing to support trade unions in developing countries. We absolutely think that this needs to be at the heart of the agenda. And of course, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and the work that she has led internationally on modern slavery is absolutely requiring this to be at the heart of what we do.
Mike Wood! Mr. Speaker, the UK has been one of the biggest donors to the Education Cannot Wait Fund since it was set up in 2016. What plans does the Minister have to replenish the ECW and to maintain UK leadership for children in crises?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his steadfast championing of this cause, and we have been one of the leading contributors of this. I can announce today that we will be scaling up our support. I cannot yet announce by exactly how much.
Luke Pollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the idea of a UK hospital ship, but it must not be used as a raid on the aid budget. Will the Secretary of State reassure me that it won't be used as the first raid and will keep our 0.7% on aid, not military spending?
You can't spend any of the 0.7 on military spending. That's the whole point of being in the DAC club and committing to 0.7. But we are looking at a one HMG maritime capability. I think this will help potentially other departments as well as us. But only aid money will be spent on aid.
Kirsten Hare.
Mr. Speaker, the Dithering project in my constituency of Angus have been collecting plants so that they can make sanitary products for young women in Malawi. They've had a fantastic response from the community and are doing some fantastic work. So can my right honourable friend join with me in celebrating the work that they do to make environmentally friendly sanitary products for those who need it?
Thank the honourable lady and congratulate her for the work she has done on this and also that fantastic organisation. But in addition to congratulating them, both my departments will be providing support to make period poverty history in both the UK but also internationally.
Steen Jardine.
Thank you very much. Given that the Commission on the Status of Women is taking place at the UN this week, what steps is the government taking to explicitly recognise, promote and support the contribution of older women as part of its women's economic empowerment agenda?
Thank the honourable lady for this incredibly important question. We have a particular strategy in DFID that is looking at this and looking at placing the empowerment and particularly economic empowerment of women at the heart, and I would make particular tribute to Lord Bates in my department, who has been looking at what more we can do for widows worldwide.
Zach Goldsmith.
The UN Human Rights Council is going to vote this week on a one-sided motion minimising Hamas's role in the violent Gaza border protest last year. Will my right honourable friend assure me that the UK will continue to oppose one-sided resolutions, particularly given horrifying scenes this week in Gaza with brutal beatings of journalists and academics by Hamas?
The United Kingdom made clear some time ago that in relation to item 7 of the Human Rights Council's determination, we would move to oppose those items, and we expect to do so. In relation to Gaza, the situation is that the International Commission was not able to investigate non-state actors, but there is no doubt that the situation in Gaza was serious, as has also been determined by Israeli authorities, and the United Kingdom will maintain its position in relation to that.
Finally, Adrian Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the case of a no-deal Brexit, the Minister has given some limited assurances to NGOs accessing funds from the EU's humanitarian fund that they will underwrite them in future. Can the Minister say whether they will be prepared to do the same for NGOs accessing funds on more broader humanitarian work?
Yes. I thank the honourable gentleman for raising this important point. Yes, we are looking at widening that support. Our NGOs, whether they're humanitarian or work in other areas, are world class, and we would want them to be able to continue to work in those settings. So we have issued those guarantees. But I would say to the honourable gentleman that if he ever gets the opportunity, he knows what he can do to avoid a no-deal scenario.
Thank you. Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Pete Wishart.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am sure that the whole House will want to join me in condemning the appalling and cowardly attack in Christchurch on Friday. There can be absolutely no place in our societies for the vile ideology that drives hatred and spreads fear. I spoke to Prime Minister Ardern on Sunday. I told her that we stood with New Zealand at this time and we would provide whatever assistance was needed. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the emergency services for their handling of the terrorist incident in Stanwell on Saturday. I'm sure members from across the House will want to join me in sending our thoughts to the man who was injured. And I would like to send my deepest sympathies to the families of those killed and those injured in Utrecht on Monday. We're in regular contact with the Dutch local authorities and are standing by to offer whatever assistance is required. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that members will want to join me in expressing my deepest shock at the loss and devastation caused by the cyclone in Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. We have made, as I think has been made clear by the Secretary of State in International Development questions, we've made £6 million of UK aid available to help meet the immediate needs of people who've lost everything, and we've deployed a UK team of DFID experts to coordinate our response to this disaster. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I totally associate myself with everything the Prime Minister has said? We will never allow hate to succeed, and we do stand in solidarity with the victims of Cyclone Edie. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's deal lies in tatters. Her cabinet is an open revolt. She presides over the biggest constitutional crisis this nation has experienced. And where leadership is required, she has once again cravenly caved in to her hard Brexiteers and will now only seek a short extension to Article 50, contrary to the expressed will of this House. When will she develop a backbone and stand up to those that would take this nation to disaster? And as one of our ministers said this morning, referencing another feeble Prime Minister, weak, weak, weak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps it would be helpful in response to that question if I update the House on the forthcoming European Council and the issue of Article 50 extension. On Thursday, the House voted in favour of a short extension if the House had supported a meaningful vote before this week's European Council. The motion also made it clear that a longer extension would oblige the United Kingdom to hold elections to the European Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I do not believe such elections would be in anyone's interests. The idea that 3 years after voting to leave the EU, the people of this country should be asked to elect a new set of MEPs is, I believe, unacceptable. It would be a failure to deliver on the referendum decision that this House said it would honour.
Order, the long way to go, and what the Prime Minister is saying must be heard. The Prime Minister.
I have therefore this morning written to President Tusk, the President of the European Council, informing him that the UK seeks an extension to the Article 50 period until the 30th of June. Copies of the letter are being placed in the libraries of the House. The government intends to bring forward proposals for a third meaningful vote. If that vote is passed, the extension will give the House time to consider the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. If not, the House will have to decide how to proceed. But as Prime Minister, I am not prepared to delay Brexit any further than the 30th of June.
Colin Clark.
Will the Prime Minister welcome Oil and Gas UK's report today predicting $200 billion of new investment in the sector? supported by this government's fiscal policy, in direct contrast to the SNP failure to stimulate the Scottish economy.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the Chancellor's spring statement last week showed that this is indeed a government that is delivering for Scotland. He mentions the issue of fiscal policy and oil and gas. We've also put £260 million for the Borderlands growth deal, £68 million extra in Barnet consequentials for the Scottish Government, £79 million for a new national supercomputer at Edinburgh University. While the SNP is obsessed with independence, it's this Conservative government that is focused on growing Scotland's economy.
Jeremy Corbyn! Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by sending my condolences to all the families and friends of victims of the terror attack in New Zealand last week. The terrible events in Christchurch should remind us all there is no place for hate, and I pay tribute to the way in which Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has responded with such dignity and such compassion to this crisis, and I absolutely agree with the comments of the Prime Minister concerning the events at Stanwell and Utrecht. And I'm sure the whole House will join me and her in sending our deepest sympathies to all those who lost their loved ones and homes in the terrible cyclones that have caused devastation in Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi. I support the government in sending £6 million of aid. I hope if more aid is required, we will be able to respond urgently and generously to any demand for help from people that are so desperately suffering at the present time. Mr. Speaker, we're now in the midst of a full-scale national crisis. Incompetence, failure and intransigence from the Prime Minister and her government have brought us to this point. Parliament has rejected her deal. It's rejected no deal. The Prime Minister now has no plan. In an effort to break the deadlock, I've held meetings with members all across the House, and I'm having further meetings today to find a compromise that supports jobs and living standards. Tomorrow, I'm meeting EU Prime Ministers and officials in Brussels. This, Mr. Speaker, is a national crisis. Will the Prime Minister meet me today to discuss our proposals as a way forward to get out of this crisis?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, it's a bit rich him standing up and inviting me to meet him when for days and days he refused to meet me, and when for days and days he refused to meet me, and he then refused to allow the shadow Brexit secretary to have a further meeting with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Of course, I'm always happy to meet members across this House to discuss the issue of Europe, but I do note that opposition party leaders, when they came out from the meeting with the leader of the opposition, made it clear that what they didn't want was Brexit. We should be delivering Brexit for the people of this country.
Jeremy Corbyn! I'm not sure there was an answer to my question there, actually, Mr. Speaker. I wanted no deal taken off the table. The House has taken no deal off the table. It's time the Prime Minister took no deal off the table. Mr. Speaker, the CBI said the extension vote is a welcome dose of common sense. Put in place a new process, drop the red lines. Every MP must show leadership through compromise. Will the Prime Minister drop the red lines? Is she prepared to compromise to get through this crisis?
The right honourable gentleman talks about decisions that have been taken by this House. I'm sure it won't have passed you by, Mr. Speaker, that of course this House has voted on and rejected a second referendum. It has voted on and rejected no deal. It has voted on and rejected Labour's deal. It has voted on and rejected a customs union. And it has voted on and supported leaving with a deal. It's time this Parliament faced the consequences.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, the last time the Prime Minister tried her meaningful vote, she only managed 242 votes, slightly up on the previous attempt, but nevertheless a decisive rejection. Our plan received 296 votes, rather considerably more than that. Mr. Speaker, her government is in chaos. She's ignored the House. ignored trade unions, ignored businesses, and ignored the concerns of communities all around the country. She told the House that the EU would only allow an extension of Article 50 if there was a clear purpose. She's travelling to Brussels tomorrow morning to meet the EU summit leaders. What is her clear purpose?
I think if the right honourable gentleman had listened to the answer I gave to the first question that was posed in PMQs, he would have heard that.
Well, it wasn't clear at all, Mr. Speaker, other than she's going to try again with what we'll now term MV3. Surely, after 2 big rejections by the House, she must have noticed there isn't much support for the deal that she negotiated. So we learned this morning, Mr. Speaker, that she's only going to ask for a short extension, which directly contradicts what the Cabinet Office Minister told the House, saying in the absence of a deal, seeking such a short and critically one-off extension would be downright reckless and completely at odds with the position this House adopted only last night. So who is downright reckless here, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister ploughing on with an unachievable, unsupported deal, or others in this House who want to achieve something serious and sensible to prevent the damage to the British economy, jobs and living standards all over this country?
The right honourable gentleman talks about trying to achieve something sensible. It's the right honourable gentleman who last week abstained on a vote of a second referendum, despite the fact that it's Labour Party policy, and then had the nerve to stand up in this House and say he reiterated their support for a second referendum. He has no idea what he wants on the future of this issue. He asks about a long extension. I'm opposed to a long extension. I don't want a long extension. Setting aside the issue that a long extension would mean we would have to hold the European parliamentary elections, which I don't think is in anybody's interests. The outcome of a long extension would be endless hours and days of this House carrying on contemplating its navel on Europe and failing to address the issues that matter to our constituents. Their schools...
Order. The answer from the Prime Minister must be heard, and everybody else will be heard. The Prime Minister.
The outcome of a long extension would be this House spending yet more endless hours contemplating its navel on Europe and failing to address the issues that matter to our constituents, schools and hospitals and security and jobs. This House has indulged itself on Europe for too long.
Order. There's a lot of very noisy barracking. Order. The Prime Minister's reply will be heard, and colleagues know that I am happy for the exchanges to take place for as long as is necessary to ensure that they are orderly. The Prime Minister.
It's time for this House to determine that it will deliver on Brexit for the British people. That's what the British people deserve. They deserve better than this House has given them so far.
Mr. Speaker, to describe the parliamentary process as one of indulgence doesn't show much respect for the democratic process that sent us here in the first place. The House, Mr. Speaker, has twice rejected the Prime Minister's deal. She's trying to come back for another attempt on Monday. Further to your ruling last Monday, she's got to come up with something a bit different than she's come up with so far. So what significant changes will there be, either to the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration, that will even allow the Prime Minister to table it on Monday?
The right honourable gentleman talks about respect for democracy. Respect for democracy means that this House should deliver the Brexit that the British people voted for. And the right honourable gentleman now wants to disrespect democracy by holding a second referendum. It is not this government that is being disrespectful of the British people. It is the Right Honourable Gentleman and his Labour Party.
Jeremy Corbyn! The job of Parliament is to hold government to account, and the Prime Minister doesn't seem to understand that. When she was first defeated, she promised legally binding changes. I haven't seen those legally binding changes. All she's doing is running down the clock after a second heavy defeat. Today, Mr. Speaker, marks 1,000 days since the referendum. And this government has led the country and themselves into crisis, chaos and division. We are still legally due to leave the European Union in 9 days' time. Months of running down the clock and a concerted campaign of blackmail, bullying and bribery has failed to convince the House, or the country, that her deal is anything but a damaging national failure and should be rejected. They've run out of time. They've run out of ideas. People, Mr. Speaker, all over this country are anxious and frustrated with this government's utter inability to find a way through the crisis. If the Prime Minister cannot get changes to her deal, will she give the people a chance to reject the deal and change the government?
Can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I think he's actually just made the point that I was making in my previous answer to him, that he doesn't want to actually respect the vote that took place in the referendum in 2016. We have a deal that keeps millions of livelihoods safe and secure. It protects the Union for the future. It means murderers and rapists on the run can be brought back quickly to face justice in this country. No deal won't do that. The deal is good for this country. It delivers Brexit and it should be supported.
Peter Aldous. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The announcement this week of the closure of Coe's Lowestoft shop, following on from those of Beale's, Argos and Body Shop, highlights the challenges that the High Street in Lowestoft currently faces. To address these, Waveney District Council are submitting an expression of interest to the Future High Street Fund, which I anticipate will be heavily oversubscribed. I acknowledge the various initiatives the government have put forward, but can the Prime Minister assure me that a coordinated, sustained and properly resourced approach, working with councils, will be pursued to revitalise our town centres, which are so vital to local communities and economies?
Well, first of all, my honourable friend makes an important point about the significance of town centres for our local communities. Can I say to my honourable friend, thank you also for highlighting the work that we are doing, the help we're providing through the Future High Streets Fund. Of course, high streets are changing, but we want to help them in that process and help them to adapt. That's why, as he said, the Future High Streets Fund is there. It has £675 million available to support local areas. But I'd like to also reassure my honourable friend that in doing this, we will be promoting partnership across the public and private sector, including local businesses, in developing those plans for the future of their high streets.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the outrage that we all feel from what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand? We must work collectively together to drive hate out of our societies across the globe. And our thoughts are very much with the people of Mozambique, with Zimbabwe and those from Malawi. And we must do all we can to support those in those communities. Mr. Speaker, all our constituents will be watching on at the crisis and chaos that we're in, and we need to reflect on the fact that we are a week away from what is the intended day from leaving the European Union and the responsibilities that we all have. Mr. Speaker, 6 days ago, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said, in the absence of a deal, seeking such a short and critically one-off extension would be downright reckless. Whoa. Downright reckless, Prime Minister. Does she agree with her de facto deputy that her actions this morning are downright reckless?
As I have set out clearly for the House in a number of answers that I've now given on this question, I believe this House has a responsibility to deliver on the Brexit people voted for Brexit, we have a responsibility to deliver on. I recognise that the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues in the SNP have always taken the position they want to revoke Article 50 and not have Brexit. The Honourable Gentleman shouts correct from a sedentary position. At least that's a firm position, which is different from the Leader of the Opposition, who has continually moved his position on this issue. But I also believe that nearly 3 years on from the vote having taken place to deliver on Brexit for the British people, it is time for this House to face that fact, to face the consequences of its decisions, and to deliver on Brexit for the British people.
Order! We can't have people shouting out in the middle of the exchanges. Order! I don't need any help from any member in dealing with these matters, with which I'm very well familiar. The Prime Minister. Grateful too. Has he had two? Yeah, he's had two. Mr. Peter. No, sorry. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Prime Minister that we need to reflect that her deal had the biggest defeat in parliamentary history. She brought it back. It had the fourth biggest defeat in parliamentary history. Her deal has failed. This House has voted against no deal. Once again, the Prime Minister is acting in her own self-interest, not in the interests of the whole of the UK. The Prime Minister has failed. This place has failed. And Scotland is watching. The only way forward now, Mr. Speaker, is to put the decision back to the people. Will the Prime Minister give the people a say in such a referendum? Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland deserve a choice over their future. If Westminster fails, Scotland will act.
Can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that there is an enormous responsibility. It's a huge honour and privilege to sit in this chamber, to be elected as a Member of Parliament, to represent our constituents. And we all have a responsibility. And this Parliament gave the decision to the British people. It took place in a referendum in 2016, and the result of that referendum was that we should leave the European Union. And the result of that referendum was that we should leave the European Union. And I believe for people to be able to have trust in their politicians and faith in this Parliament, it is imperative that this Parliament delivers on the Brexit that people voted for.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, in June 2016, the country voted to leave the European Union. In February 2017, this House voted by a majority of 384 to trigger Article 50. The Prime Minister in this House has said on 108 times that we will be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. Last week, 2/3 of her MPs voted against any extension to Article 50. Prime Minister, if you continue to apply for an extension to Article 50, you will be betraying the British people. If you don't, you will be honouring their instruction. Prime Minister, it is entirely down to you. History will judge you at this moment. Prime Minister.
Order. I'm not having the Honourable Gentleman denied the chance and the right to be heard. The Honourable Gentleman must and will be heard. Mr. Peter Bone.
Prime Minister, which is it to be?
Can I thank my honourable friend has been consistent in his challenging me on the 29th of March date in Prime Minister's questions and in statements and indeed in debates. I have always wanted us to be able to leave on the 29th of March. But I believe, as was said during the referendum campaign by those who wanted to leave, that it was better to leave with a negotiated deal with the European Union. Yes. That is why I am saying that I think we should look again at being able to leave with a negotiated deal. But in order to do that, we need time for this Parliament to ratify a deal. And in order to do that, we need an extension until June the 30th. But as I have said, as Prime Minister, I could not consider a delay further beyond the 30th of June. This is the point at which this House has the decision to take as to what it wants the future to be. That is what is facing this House, and that is a decision I believe we should take, honouring the result of the referendum.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited a school in my constituency where distressing poverty means that teachers are not only providing food for the children at breakfast and lunch, they are sourcing clothes and buying shoes for them, in addition to raising money for books and equipment. Now that school, the only one in the area, is threatened with closure. So rather than spending money trying to get people to back her Brexit deal, could I ask the Prime Minister, please, to use it to address the acute social need in this country that is bringing families and communities to their knees?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be well aware that we are putting more money into our schools. We are ensuring that we have a welfare system that does encourage people into the workplace, and we have put more money into various other elements of care for people across our communities. The best solution for people to ensure that they are able to provide for themselves and their families is for us to have a strong economy and for people to be helped into work. And that's why it was so pleasing to see this week that we see, yet again, employment levels at a record high in this country.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To overcome homelessness, we need more homes. And in Chelmsford, we're building 1,000 new homes every year. But we also need the infrastructure. So this week, Essex County Council is putting in bids for housing infrastructure funding, including the second train station in Chelmsford. Does my right honourable friend agree that world-class infrastructure is vital for our future? And will she support our 25-year campaign for Chelmsford's second train station?
Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I welcome the action that Essex County Council has taken in relation to new homes. I welcome their bid to the Housing Infrastructure Fund. It's important we've made that money available in the Housing Infrastructure Fund because we understand the importance of infrastructure for new housing developments. We recognise the need for additional affordable housing in the South East. Of course, the Department for Transport will look very carefully at the bid which will come in for the second railway station that my honourable friend has referred to. But I'm pleased to be able to say that we're only able to do this because this is a government that is putting record levels of money into capital investment in our country.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister campaigned to keep Section 28, which banned LGBT people being talked about positively in schools and led to millions of young people like myself growing up in fear of being LGBT. I thought the Prime Minister had seen the error of her ways, but this morning the Leader of the House said on radio that parents should decide when they're exposed to LGBT education. This is Conservative Party dog whistle politics. Will the Prime Minister condemn the Leader of the House? Will she condemn bigots that don't want LGBT people to be heard in schools? And will she support Ofsted with good LGBT education in our schools?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I'm very happy to write to him with the detail of the guidance that is given to schools on LGBT education and teaching. I think it is important. My right honourable friend, the Minister for Women and Equalities, Secretary of State for International Development, has been at great pains to ensure, working with the Department for Education, that appropriate guidance is given to schools. And I will write to him. I recognise the issue that the honourable gentleman has raised, and I will write to him with the details of the guidance because it is very clear about what is appropriate.
Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Cornwall, we want to be as environmentally friendly as possible. In fact, we want to be carbon-free by 2030. For me, this means improving the quality of our homes. It means making use of all forms of renewable energy and ensuring sustainable food production. Will my friend, the Prime Minister, welcome the aspirations of communities like Cornwall, and will her government ensure that robust policies are in place to meet net zero emission commitments more quickly?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. Certainly, I'm delighted to hear of the aspirations that Cornwall has in relation to being carbon-free and the action that is being taken. We're happy to support that. We have a good record on climate change as a government, but we're doing more. Our annual support for renewables will be over £10 billion by 2021. Our ambitious clean growth strategy sets out our plan for decarbonising the UK economy through to 2032. So we will be putting in the policies in place that will enable areas like Cornwall to be able to achieve their commitment in relation to climate change.
Alex Norris.
Mr. Speaker, 4,621 words in the Chancellor's spring statement, but not a single mention of WASPy women. The Prime Minister came to office vowing to tackle burning injustices. Well, these women worked all their lives for their pension and had it taken from them without their knowledge. Does the Prime Minister really not think this is a burning injustice?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that he knows full well in relation to the issue of the WASPy women that this is a government that did put extra money in. We've been very clear no one will see their pension age change by more than 18 months relative to the 1995 Act timetable, and those with the most significant changes did receive at least 7 years' notice. But we do want to see the empowerment of women in the workplace, the empowerment of women in our economy, and that is why my right honourable friend, the Minister for Women and Equalities, will be bringing forward a strategy on that very soon.
Bill Grant.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom average unemployment is at a remarkable 4%, a very welcome low. In Air Carrigan Cumnock, however, it stands at 6.5%. Can my right honourable friend give an assurance to my constituents that she will continue to work in building employment nationally with a particular focus on areas where unemployment is significantly higher than the UK average?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that he has raised a particularly important point? If I may just pull him up on one point, actually we have now seen that the employment rate across the UK is 3.9%, not 4%. Unemployment rate across the UK is 3.9%. Employment in Scotland has risen by 239,000 since the 2010 election, and what we've seen in the spring statement was our economy growing every year, borrowing lower than expected, debt falling. But I absolutely recognise the concerns my honourable friend has raised. That's why we will continue to work as a UK government to deliver more jobs, healthier finances and an economy that is fit for the future across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, hate crime is on the rise and our democracy increasingly based on fear both in Parliament and the country. Shocking Home Office figures show that hate crimes doubled from 2011 to over 100,000 last year. The country looks to politicians to set a high standard. But last week, the Prime Minister's allies were texting fellow honourable members saying, "I'm going to chloroform you and drag you through the lobbies to vote for the Prime Minister's deal." Does she find this behaviour acceptable, or will she be removing the whip from the offending member?
Can I say to the honourable lady that she is absolutely right that politicians at all levels need to think very carefully about the terms in which we address others and the terms in which we put our arguments. And there are many members across this House who have suffered significantly from verbal abuse, from abuse online of various sorts. This is a matter that we should all be taking seriously, and I will be ensuring that across this House we work to ensure that people are not subject to the sort of abuse that sadly some members of this House have been subject to from outside this House.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, back in the world beyond Brexit, she'll be aware that my Civil Partnerships Private Members Bill completed its stages. Since when I've received hundreds of letters of thanks, including no fewer than 6 from prospective civil partners who proposed after my bill went through, and many from anxious mothers wanting to know when they will be able to sign their son or daughter's marriage certificate. So will she guarantee that every effort will now be made to ensure that these measures come in well before the end of the year and that there will not be a prolonged period of implementation?
Can I thank my honourable friend for the legislation and for working with the government on that legislation? And can I say to my honourable friend that we are working to bring this in as quickly as possible to ensure that the measures that are in that legislation are available as soon as possible to people.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Prime Minister has been on her feet, the national crisis appears to have deepened, in that the EU Commission says that either it's an extension until the 23rd of May or until the end of 2019. Will the Prime Minister listen to the hundreds of thousands of young people who will march peacefully to Parliament Square to say that they would like to have a chance to have their say in this debate and put it back to the people, subject to the Kyle and Wilson amendment, which is basically a compromise in this House.
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, I've answered many questions in recent weeks and months on the question of putting a vote back to the people of this country. I continue to believe that it is for this House to recognise that, having asked people their view, having heard the view from those people, that we should actually deliver on that view. That is our responsibility. It's about delivering Brexit.
Mr. Kenneth Clark. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister says, this House has voted clearly to reject leaving with no deal, and it's voted clearly to seek an extension if her withdrawal agreement cannot get a majority. But this House has not yet had the opportunity to debate and vote on the range of options for long-term arrangements, such as customs union, regulatory alignment, and so on. So would she arrange next week for indicative votes finally to be held so we can see where the consensus, where the majority lies, because a short extension of Article 50 will be completely useless if the government goes into it with no idea of what it's going to have the authority to negotiate in the long term.
Well, can I say to my right honourable and learned friend, I think he will have noticed the House has had many opportunities, actually, to put forward motions of the issue that he has. Yes, the House has. The House has rejected alternatives to the government's deal. The House has voted against a customs union. The House has voted against having a second referendum. The House has, from a sedentary position, somebody on the opposition front bench says, we won't let the House. The House has voted on these issues and has rejected them. We have been clear about our intention to absolutely fulfil the requirement that we have to bring forward an amendable motion under Section 13(4) of the Withdrawal Act, and we will indeed be doing that.
Stephen Giffin.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents Tasnim, who's 7, and Hashim, who's 9, have been stuck in war-torn Sana'a, seeing things that no child should ever see. They managed to get out, and the government's asked them to go to Khartoum in Sudan, where they've been asked to wait until their mum can pass an English language test. Now, they have a safe home in Cooper in my constituency with their dad. I've briefed the Prime Minister about this. Will she let the family, all of the family, go home to safety in my constituency?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, thank you, and I thank him for writing to me with details of this case and for bringing it to my attention. Obviously, I mean, as he will expect, when the Home Office receives applications, they look at them carefully, they look at exceptional circumstances. What I have done is ask the Home Office to look urgently at this case and ask the relevant minister to respond to the honourable gentleman as soon as possible.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that if she brings her deal again to the House, I will again support it. But will she confirm today that the full length of the extension she is seeking from the EU will be available to the House, regardless of whether it supports her measure or seeks another way forward?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman, as I think he will have heard me say in my answer to the very first question that was posed in Prime Minister's questions today, the government intends to bring forward proposals for third reading vote. If that vote's passed, the extension will give the House time to consider the withdrawal agreement bill. If not, the House will have to decide how to proceed.
Jed Killen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 50 years since the closure of J&J White's chemical factory in my constituency, the local area is still blighted by carcinogenic hexavalent chromium contamination. To date, Clyde Gateway has received £6 million of EU funds to decontaminate and regenerate land, but tens of millions more will be required to complete the work. Will the Prime Minister give a commitment that post-Brexit, the UK Government will make similar funding available in the long term to complete that work?
The honourable gentleman has raised a very specific case with me in relation to a certain type of funding. I'd be very happy to ask the relevant minister to respond to him on the specifics of that case in relation to his constituency.
Sir William Cash.
Will my right honourable friend rule out introducing the Withdrawal and Implementation Bill if her withdrawal agreement is voted down yet again by the House next week? and then let the United Kingdom leave the European Union on the 29th of March as the people's vote in 2016, as Parliament has enacted and as the law requires.
I say to my honourable friend, what I have done today in writing to President Tusk is ask for that extension to Article 50 to the end of June. I've been clear that that is, as I've said, that I don't believe Brexit should be delayed beyond that point. That would give us the opportunity to ensure that the House can consider again a deal and then take forward the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill in the circumstances that a deal was passed. In the circumstances that the deal was not passed, then it would be necessary, obviously, for the House to consider, as I've just said, to our honourable friend, the right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, how we should proceed. I would also say to my honourable friend, as he will have heard the DEFRA Secretary saying in the debate on no deal last week, there are particular issues, particularly in relation to the governance of Northern Ireland, in relation to leaving the European Union without a deal on the 29th of March. I continue to hope and continue to believe that the best way for this country to leave the European Union is to do so on a basis of a negotiated deal, and the extension to 30th of June would allow us to do that.
Ed Miliband. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the Father of the House, does the Prime Minister not realise that in her answer, she is the roadblock to this House reaching a majority, not the facilitator of it? It is blindingly obvious, including, I believe, to members of the Cabinet, that what the House now needs to do is have a series of indicative votes, precisely so it can express its will about what it is for, not simply what it is against. Why doesn't the Prime Minister agree to that? And she would be doing the service to the country if she did.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, obviously I've made clear that we will bring forward the motion that is required under the legislation under section 13(4). But if I could just gently say to the right honourable gentleman, as I did to my right honourable and learned friend, that it is not the case that it has not been possible for this House to bring forward votes of the sort that the right honourable gentleman is talking about. It has been open to this House. In some cases, the House has brought forward such votes, and those have been rejected.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend and this House gave its solemn word to the British people that we would leave the EU on the 29th of March, on Friday week. If this extension happens, my right honourable friend, what guarantee can you give the British people that at the end of June, if we still do not have a deal, we honour that referendum result and we leave?
Can I say to my honourable friend that I made clear in the debate we had, I think in the debate we had, one of the debates last week or the previous week, that if it is the case that there is an extension, this does not actually take no deal off the table. It leaves that as a point at the end of that extension. Now, whether or not we have that extension is not a matter purely for the United Kingdom, it is a matter for the European Union Council. They have, up until now, been very clear, and obviously I wait to see what they say tomorrow, but they have been very clear that any extension could only be if there was a clear purpose for that extension, and that we could not go beyond the date I've suggested without holding European parliamentary elections. I don't believe it's in anybody's interest to hold European parliamentary elections. I believe it is time that we actually delivered on the vote of the British people in 2016, and that's why, as I said earlier, in response to the first question, as Prime Minister, as far as I'm concerned, there would be no delay in delivering Brexit beyond the 30th of June.
Anna Seabury.
As the Prime Minister has told us, she is today seeking a short and one-off extension to Article 50. Last Thursday, her Deputy Prime Minister told this House at that dispatch box that any such application would be downright reckless and completely at odds with the position that this House adopted only last night. The question is, Prime Minister, what changed?
Can I say to the right honourable lady, I seem to see a certain similarity between her question and a couple of the questions that came from the official opposition on this issue. But as I said to them, I think we should all remember the responsibility we have in this House to ensure that we deliver Brexit. And as I have said, I believe a short extension of the type that I have indicated, that I've written to President Tusk about today, is a sensible request to put forward. But I've also been clear, as I have in response to my honourable friend from the backbenches, that I also believe that the British people will not thank this House. Will not thank this House if we do anything other than deliver Brexit and in a reasonable timetable, and that's by the end of June.
Mr. Nicholas Bowles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for allowing me to continue to represent the people of Grantham and Stamford from these Conservative benches. On the 26th of February, my right honourable friend said from the dispatch box, and I quote, "If the House votes for an extension, the government will seek to agree that extension approved by the House with the EU and bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date commensurate with that extension." When will she give this House the opportunity to approve her extension request? When will she bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date?
Well, the suggestion of the extension to the end of June was, of course, considered by this House last week. It is necessary, before it is possible for that to be confirmed, and the request has gone into the European Union Council, before that request can be confirmed, it is, of course, necessary for the EU Council to agree that extension, because the treaty is clear that an extension can be applied for by the party, the country that is leaving the European Union, but it has to be agreed by all 28 members of the European Union, and that will not be possible until the European Council at the end of this week.
The Prime Minister still has to ask the EU to agree to something. And at the moment, all she's asking anybody to agree to is the same plan that she has put to this House twice and that has been roundly defeated twice. Why will she not just open up, just think again, just allow the indicative votes that others have put forward? Because what she is doing by sticking to this failed plan is deeply dangerous for our country. In the national interest, I beg this Prime Minister to think again.
What is first and foremost in the national interest is for this country to leave the European Union and to do so in a way that does protect people's livelihoods and protects their security and protects our union. That is the proposal that we have put forward. The Right Honourable Lady has raised again the issue of indicative votes. As I will say to her, as I've said to others, first of all, we stand by the requirement that we have to bring the motion under 13.4 of the Withdrawal Act, which we will do, and we will bring that motion to this House. And it is appropriate within the timetable set within the legislation. But I also say to the Right Honourable Lady, it is the case that there have been votes in this House on some of the other proposals that have been put forward, and those have equally been rejected. There is one thing that this House has agreed to, and that is that it would leave with a deal. It was in relation with changes in relation to the backstop, and that is the one positive vote that the House has given.
David Duquette.
Much, Mr. Speaker. After much representation from the charity Max Appeal, the National Screening Committee is for the first time considering adding 22q11 syndrome to the newborn blood spot test. This second most common chromosomal disorder after Down syndrome can lead to avoidable mental health issues if not diagnosed and managed from a young age. So therefore, would my right honourable friend join me and the APPG, of which I am chair, in calling for this condition to be added to the newborn blood spot test?
Very good. Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, can I commend him and the APPG for the work that they are doing in this area. He's obviously raised a very important issue. I will ask the Department for Health and Social Care to respond to him, appropriate minister to respond to him, and possibly to meet him and talk to him about this issue.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has a very selective view of the decisions that this country has made. She mentions the referendum, but she never mentions the general election, which denied her the authority for a hard Brexit.
Remove the authority.
She's mentioned
list the things that this House has voted against, but failed to mention that her deal has been defeated by large amounts now twice. And she seems determined to plough on as if nothing has happened to her deal and cause a huge crisis. Surely now, Mr. Speaker, the time is for the Prime Minister to recognise that she has to stop banging her head against the brick wall of her defeated deal and reach out across this House in the interest of stability and our democracy and come to a deal which actually has the support of a majority of this House rather than kowtowing to her own Brextremists.
The point is that so far, apart from saying that it would support leaving with a deal with changes to that deal in relation to the backstop, the House has given no positive vote on what it wants to go forward. And I would also remind the Honourable Lady, she talks about the 2017 general election. I would also remind her that 80% of the votes cast in that general election. No, it's no good Labour members going like this. 80% of the votes cast in that election were cast from parties that stood on a manifesto of honouring the result of the 2016 referendum.
Oh, very well. If it appertains to matters of which the House has just treated, I'm willing to take it now. If it does not, I won't, because there's a proper time for such matters. It does relate to matters of which we've just treated. Point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, it relates to the question asked by my honourable friend, the member for Brighton, regarding the comments made by the Leader of the House this morning on the radio regarding LGBT education, and it relates to forthcoming business later today. Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware that there is an important statutory instrument due to be debated on sex and relationships education and LGBT inclusive education, but obviously we understand that you have granted a number of urgent questions and there will be an SO24 application. What steps can we take to ensure that that debate is not lost and that we do have it so that we can debate the comments made by the Leader of the House and ensure that we have inclusive education across this country?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. The short answer to him is that, if I understand correctly, and I believe I do, the time for that matter is protected. That is to say, notwithstanding the duration of urgent questions and the possibility of a Standing Order number 24 debate, the House will get to consider that matter. And I hope that that brings a smile to the face of the honourable gentleman. Indeed. Does it relate to that of which we've just treated? Point of order, Caroline Flint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing my point of order. It does relate to the discussions around the extension of Article 50 and the agenda this afternoon for the debate. Could the Speaker confirm for me that this will require us, any extension, to take part in the European Union elections, and we will have to lay the orders in this House before 11th of April so that local authorities can publish election notices on the 12th for the South West and Gibraltar and the 15th of April for the rest of the UK. We have a duty to make sure that if we're extending, we will take part in those European elections, and we need to lay the orders.
Grateful to the right honourable lady, and she was as good as her word. It did relate to matters of which the House has just treated, but notwithstanding her beguiling invitation to me to pronounce on the matter, I genuinely don't think that it is for me to do so. It may very well depend on the length of any extension sought, and it does seem to me that it is a matter which must be pronounced upon by the government front bench in the course of upcoming exchanges. Now, if the right honourable lady wants to be assured that she will have the opportunity to put that proposition directly to a minister, I think I can offer her that guarantee. So she will have her chance. But it's not a matter for the chair. We come now to, but I'm grateful to the right honourable lady and to the honourable gentleman for their points of order. Order. Urgent question, Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister if she will make a statement on Britain's help to those caught up in the cyclone disaster that is afflicting Southern Africa?
Minister Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join with me in expressing shock at the loss and devastation following the deadly cyclone Idai across southern Africa. Alongside the Met Office, we have been tracking this cyclone, and supplies were pre-positioned in Mozambique. We have so far committed £6 million to respond to immediate needs. I'm pleased to inform the House that more tents and thousands of shelter kits have now landed in Mozambique. We have teams on the ground in each of the 3 countries affected, including humanitarian and relief experts. We're working with other international partners, including the UN and the Red Cross, to address immediate needs across the 3 countries.
Indeed. The Honourable Lady has completed her contribution, a preliminary contribution. We're grateful to her. Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This massive disaster, Mr. Speaker, has swept across southern Africa, in particular affecting 3 Commonwealth and suspended Commonwealth countries. The United Nations has made clear that hundreds of thousands of people are affected, and that this is heading towards being the worst weather-related disaster to hit the southern hemisphere. The President of Mozambique says 1,000 of his citizens have perished, and as we have seen graphically on our television from the reporting by the BBC's Fergal Keane, the important port city of Beira has been flattened, with almost all port structures destroyed and the collapse of bridges and roads. In Malawi, nearly 900,000 people have been directly affected, with many having lost everything. The dangers confronting those caught up in this disaster, Mr. Speaker, include the loss of everything they own, the difficulty of getting food and medicines through to those affected, the dangers of waterborne diseases, including cholera, due to the contamination of the water supply. The risk of starvation and famine are very real, with harvests destroyed and livestock drowned. I'm sure the Minister agrees that the UK has an important role to play, given our acknowledged international leadership in this area, and she has set out some of what we have already done. The strong support and generosity we know exists all across the UK for stepping up immediately when these hideous so-called natural disasters take place is worth bearing in mind, and of course the huge repository of expertise which exists within DFID and British NGOs and charities, which is respected all around the world and which was greatly boosted by the report on Britain's international emergency response, so brilliantly undertaken by the late Lord Paddy Ashton. Will the government note, Mr. Speaker, that the search and rescue response so far has been much slower than in the crisis in 2000? One of those who is today in Beira, who was also there in 2000, says the response then was 10 times as great for a much lesser disaster. Thousands of families, Mr. Speaker, remain stranded. A huge global response is now required, and the UK has a key leadership role to discharge in that.
Minister.
Well, can I start by congratulating my right honourable friend on securing today's urgent question, which has allowed us to echo the sentiments that he has so eloquently expressed in terms of our solidarity with the people of Mozambique, with Malawi and with Zimbabwe, who have been hit by what the United Nations has described as being potentially the worst cyclone ever to happen in the southern hemisphere. And I alluded in my opening remarks to the role played by the Met Office, which has actually been extremely helpful in predicting not only the likelihood of the positioning of the landfall, but also allowed us to pre-position some of the supply in terms of food, in terms of medicines, in terms of cholera kits, in terms of shelter, that is important in terms of securing a response. And he rightly alludes to the UK's leadership in this area. I believe we've shown that leadership by being one of the very first to announce additional funding to this disaster. He will know that we do have some of those experts already deployed on the ground, and he will be aware that I'm sure he will have heard from his contacts that the Disaster Emergencies Committee will also shortly be announcing a further appeal, and that I think the UK does, in terms of not only our Commonwealth friends, but our suspended Commonwealth friends, have a crucial role to play and are playing in terms of that leadership to the situation. I was, in fact, myself in Beira only last month and was able to testify to the strength of the bilateral relationship, not only between ourselves and the people of Mozambique, but of course the strong link that exists between the city of Beira and the city of Bristol in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I begin by echoing the Minister's feelings. I know that this House is united in our thoughts for the tragic impact of this devastating cyclone, which may be the worst ever disaster to strike the Southern Hemisphere. I welcome the £6 million relief effort from DFID, and I am delighted to hear that this is now reaching people on the ground. But we know that unless immediate action is taken to halt catastrophic climate change, extreme weather events such as this will become much more frequent. And we know that it is the poorest people in the global south who will suffer the most. This must be a wake-up call to governments everywhere to urgently deliver on Paris Agreement target of remaining below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And if we are serious about doing this, then we need to start reducing our own global carbon emissions now. So what is the government doing to ensure it does this? And another key component of the Paris Agreement was a commitment to address the devastation caused to poor nations by climate change through funding for loss and damage. What government support is being given to fund this strand of the agreement? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the ability of Mozambique to respond and rebuild from this disaster will be seriously impaired by the country's debt crisis, triggered by $2 billion of secret loans from London-based banks. What action is the government taking to ensure the London banks are held to account for their role in Mozambique's debt crisis? And will she work with partners to relieve the debt burden faced by Mozambique so the country can rebuild? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can endorse what she was saying there in terms of the UK's important role to play in terms of leadership on climate change. The UK has already committed £5.8 billion during this spending review period to work with our international partners and in international climate finance. And we are able to show leadership not only in terms of our track record here in the UK, where the UK is one of the leading countries in terms of reducing its carbon emissions, but also to share some of the technical skills that we have here in the UK to address it, whether it's in the offshore wind sector, whether it's in the solar mini-grid sector. We hosted an event for African energy ministers only the week before last. And in fact, there was a representative there from the government of Mozambique. And through the City of London and the Green Finance Initiative, we have been able to bring in not only our own contribution, but a further $25 billion of climate finance, green finance, in over 90 different bond issues in 7 different currencies so far. She raised the issue of the role played by the City of London, an institution in the City of London, in the scandal a few years ago about hidden debt in Mozambique. And she will be obviously aware that I can't comment on the specific details of the case, but I can assure her that the UK will commit to ensuring that there is an investigation, and that we obviously can't comment specifically on the exact details of that investigation publicly.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, I declare my interest in the region. I certainly share the comments by my honourable friend and his sense of extreme urgency. He mentioned the 2000 cyclone, and in particular the massive damage done to Beira in particular. Lessons weren't learnt then about the need for permanent sea defences. When it comes to the reconstruction that she is promising, will she make sure that emphasis is put on installing permanent sea defences along the northeast coast of Mozambique?
Absolutely right. Minister.
Well, my honourable friend, it sounds as though he also has visited Beira, as I did, and he will be aware that the coastline of Mozambique is, I think, I'm right in saying, over 2,500 kilometres long. And I think there are ways that the coastline is particularly vulnerable. I think that building a sea defence in the situation where there is a cyclone that hits is probably not the number one way in which the resilience of the area could be improved. At the moment, of course, in terms of Beira Port, that has sustained significant damage from this particular cyclone. Beira Airport, where supplies are now arriving, is also reduced in terms of its ability to receive flights, and indeed many of the roads surrounding Beira are also underwater, and the unfortunate fact is that the rain is still falling heavily. So this is a combination not only of water from the sea but also water from the sky, and I think there are things that can be done to secure resilience, but I think that a flood defence, as he will know as a Norfolk MP, along the entire coastline of Mozambique is probably not the most compelling in terms of value for money.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the UN has described the cyclone Idai as possibly, and I quote, the worst ever disaster to strike the southern hemisphere. This is a place I've also personally visited and know quite well. It doesn't even bear thinking what it used to look like before compared to where it is now. And although the damage and death these cyclones have brought with them seem incomprehensible, this is just the beginning of the impact of increasing extreme weather we shall witness. Widely last year, the International Development Select Committee heard from Dr. Alison Doig, who noted that the United Nations Framework for Combating Climate Change has 3 pillars to avert these disasters and deal with their impact. Those are mitigation, adaptation and loss and damage. Therefore, does the Minister agree that loss and damage of property is a huge consequence of climate change? And if so, why does the UK Government only allocate official development assistance spending to mitigation and adaptation? I'd also like to ask, can we no longer pretend that these are freak accidents? We're going to see them ever increasing. So therefore, can the Secretary of State agree that we're living through a climate crisis? And if so, why will this not be made a much more urgent priority of this government? And lastly, just to say, from these benches, we share our shock and sympathy with all those families affected in Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that his committee, the committee on which he sits, is doing an important piece of work in terms of the department's overall approach to climate change. I look forward to hearing what his committee has to say. We gave evidence to his committee recently about the work that we're doing in the £5.8 billion worth of international climate finance. He will be aware that that has already helped 47 million people adapt to the impact of climate change. He will be aware that a lot of the work that we're doing is around resilience and is about ensuring that people are able to be more resilient to these kinds of more extreme weather events that climate scientists are predicting will occur. And we were recently praised in terms of the Independent ICAI's assessment of our work in saying not only that we were showing good strategic leadership, but also that the work that we were doing was effective. I agree that this is an important area on which we need to be focusing, but I can assure the honourable gentleman that we are continuing to play an important leadership role and spending a very significant amount of money in this area.
Mr. Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, one of the longer-term effects of disasters such as this is the loss of the livestock upon which people depend for their livelihoods to feed their families. My right honourable friend mentioned the Disasters Emergency Committee. There is not a single animal welfare organisation represented on the DEC. My right honourable friends seek to ensure that that shortcoming is addressed so that when people are able to return to their homes, they also have the livestock upon which they depend to return to. My
honourable friend is right to highlight that there will be an impact long after the waters have receded in terms of the ability for the local population to continue to have successful food markets, whether it's in livestock or indeed this is a particularly maize growing area, and so the early reports are that much of that maize crop has been damaged across the 3 countries. This is an absolute staple, and of course any damage to the maize crop and to the staple in terms of diet is going to have ongoing knock-on effects in terms of the food resilience of the local population, and this will be very much part of the work that we will be doing with our advisors to understand the impact on that and to see where there is an additional need for programming and international leadership.
Order, I say not just for the benefit of the House, but for that of those who are observing our proceedings beyond it, that we have 2 wonderful but competing examples of seniority in the House, seeking to catch the eye of the Chair. The mother of the House, the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, the member for Camberwell and Peckham, immensely senior, very distinguished, very busy diary. But on the other hand, immediately behind her, we have the chair of the Select Committee, a man of great seniority. So I have to be the arbiter of competing greats. Harriet Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the former International Development Secretary for bringing this matter to the House and say that I absolutely agree with all the points he raised. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. And it's evident the commitment that the Minister brings to this. And it's also evident that everyone is dismayed about the scale of the problem. But can I just ask her about people who will be particularly distraught about this? And this is the people in this country who have come from Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique, who have made their home here, who live and work here, bring up their children here, pay their taxes here and contribute to our commercial and public life, but who also are contributors through their remittances to these countries and are desperately worried about their friends and family caught up in this. Could she tell the House how she's going to engage with the diaspora communities to make sure that she understands the efforts they're trying to make and she'll help those efforts, and also that she informs them what her department is doing and listens to them, because often they will know what needs to be done. And I also pay tribute, of course, to the work of all the agencies and her department in this very difficult situation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for putting at the forefront the sorority of Harriet in your calling of questions today. She makes an important point, which was also alluded to by my right honourable friend in his introductory question, around the links between the UK and people in Mozambique, in Malawi, and in Zimbabwe. And she makes a very important point about the ways in which that we can work with the diaspora here. And I would make a commitment to honourable members that should colleagues find this to be useful, that I could convene a meeting for colleagues who have the opportunity, therefore, to make representations on behalf of their constituents about what specifically we can be doing to help differently, but also what information can be found about their relatives. And of course, I can do that either in a face-to-face meeting or, of course, always happy to take telephonic or letters of inquiry as well.
Paul Blackman.
Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend for bringing this important issue to the House. Indeed, the British public at a time of humanitarian crisis are always incredibly generous. What arrangements is my honourable friend making to ensure that the British public who want to contribute either money, food, clothing or other means of assistance can do so in a constructive way so that we can help these people that are facing a terrible crisis immediately rather than delaying anything?
Well, can I also add my tribute to the generosity of my honourable friends' constituents? And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a Disasters Emergency Committee campaign launch to raise money for this disaster, because as we have noted, not only is there a need for immediate relief, and that the UK has been at the forefront in terms of pre-positioning some of that relief, but also there will be an ongoing need to rebuild these communities and to help with some of the food access issues that have been raised by my honourable friend. And so I would urge constituents who want to make a contribution to await the imminent launch of that particular appeal.
Mr. Stephen Twigg.
Can I welcome what the Minister has said today, and as she described to the House, the Select Committee is currently looking at climate change. Rightly, the focus today is on the humanitarian relief and the immediate challenge, but of course what we know is the long-term development needs of these countries must not be forgotten. Can she say what DFID will be doing, working with other donors and the countries concerned, to ensure that Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe can rebuild after this, and in particular with a focus on necessary health and education investment?
Minister.
Well, he's so right to point to the long-term nature of this work. So there is the short-term response that we need to put in place, but there needs to be a long-term strategic response. And as some of the very poorest countries in the world are some of the most vulnerable to climate change, Malawi, I think, is estimated to be the third poorest country in the world, Mozambique, the seventh poorest country in the world. It is therefore a special responsibility for those of us who are paying in terms of international climate finance to also make sure that we do whatever we can to encourage countries such as the ones that are affected here to be successful in bidding for some of those funds, and which is the reason we had the African Energy Ministers event. It's the reason that as part of our new approach to Africa, we are hiring a further 20 climate specialists across our African network to be able to help deploy some of that finance into these countries which are particularly vulnerable.
Neil Parish.
And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And our helpful sympathy goes out to the people of Mozambique and Malawi and Zimbabwe. And of course, the point's been raised here that not only is it about feeding and saving people now, but it's also feeding them into the future. So fitting into not only the British community, but the British farming community, I'm sure we can actually help to get cattle and other things back into those regions. But my one particular point, Minister, I want to raise with you is that Zimbabwe naturally is suspended from the Commonwealth because of corruption, because of bad governance and lack of democracy, and it's quite right to suspend them. But it's not the fault of the Zimbabwean people that they've got such a corrupted government. And what more help can we give Zimbabwe, because the country is very weak due to its lack of good governance and democracy?
Very good point. Minister.
Well, we have always been a steadfast friend of the people of Zimbabwe, and this year alone we will have programmed some £84 million worth of programming through the Department for International Development, none of which, I must emphasise, goes through the government of Zimbabwe, which is designed to help the most vulnerable, designed to help with education, designed to help with access to healthcare, and designed to help with some of the agricultural resilience work that I have alluded to. So he is absolutely right to put on record the steadfast friendship between the people of the UK, the people of Zimbabwe, the people of Malawi and the people of Mozambique.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't this another example of the devastating impact of climate change on the very poorest countries in the world? And although, as my honourable friend, the Chair of the International Development Select Committee has said, this is about the humanitarian debate today, but can the Foreign Minister tell us what the Foreign Office will be doing at the UN and other multinational organisations to press the case for not just redoubling our efforts on climate change, but retrebling them so these incidents don't happen in the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was able to give evidence to his Foreign Affairs Committee the other day, and one of the things I was talking about in terms of our new approach to Africa was the increased emphasis that we're putting in terms of adaptation to climate change across particularly the poorest and most vulnerable countries in Africa. With regards to the UN specifically, he will be aware that the UK has been asked to lead the work in terms of resilience at the September UN Climate Summit, and so that is a piece of work that we are taking forward to show real leadership in that area.
Kate Hoey.
The Minister will know that eastern Zimbabwe, particularly around Chimanimani, has been completely devastated. Roads closed, nobody really being able to get in unless by helicopter. And of course, the special circumstances of Zimbabwe already mentioned by my friend from the other side of the House. And I wonder if she could just add a little bit more to what specifically our ambassador in Zimbabwe is doing and how we are actually making sure that we're really going to get that aid to the people who are going to need it most.
Well, the Honourable Lady who chairs the all-party group on Zimbabwe will want to know that we have been at the forefront of trying to work with our partners to assess the scale of the need. The port of Beira is not just the port for a large part of Mozambique, but it's also the port which is most used by Zimbabwe and Malawi in terms of food imports and exports. And so therefore that is in addition a particular vulnerability. Now I understand from those early assessments that reports from eastern Zimbabwe suggest that there has been a severe degradation in terms of the infrastructure as well, and how difficult it is to access all of the afflicted populations. We can't overemphasize enough how difficult it is for us to be able to reach people. The pre-deployed kits have reached the airport at Beira, but at the moment there are many roads out of Beira which are closed, and that will affect eastern Zimbabwe's response as well. So we are at the forefront of working with partners, for example UNICEF in eastern Zimbabwe, but it will need to inform after the rain has stopped our ability to respond to some of the lasting damage there.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, it's World Water Day on Friday, but for people in Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe, there's water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And in the cross-party group on Malawi, which I chair, we've been following the effect of devastating floods which already been hitting the country before the cyclone. And the Minister might be aware the Scottish Government has already made a donation in support of that, and civic society is responding as well. But can I specifically ask the Minister what steps her department will take to improve resilience in these countries because of climate change? Such extreme weather events are becoming more common. So how can countries be supported before the disaster hits, that resilience is there in the infrastructure?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this allows me to pay tribute to the Scotland-Malawi partnership and the statistic that 43% of people in Scotland know someone or are themselves part of links between Scotland and Malawi. And I know that civil society across Scotland will be engaging both with those local partnerships, but also more widely with the appeal. And can I thank everyone in Scotland for their generosity for this cause. He asked specifically about the work that we're going to be doing for resilience and for the United Nations. And resilience takes many, many forms, but one of the most important forms is the crops that are sown and the ways in which they're sown and the way that the land is used. And so that's an important part of the work that we're doing to help farmers make use of the land in a way that gives them the best resilience to these kinds of climate shocks.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has been mentioned, Bristol's links with the fellow port city of Beira go back a long way back to the days of anti-apartheid campaign, and we're officially twinned. There's already a fundraising effort going on in Bristol to try to support people in Beira. But how can we best work with DFID to make sure that we can constructively share information and get the help to people that most need it?
Well, can I thank the people of Bristol? And when I was in Beara recently and met with the Mayor of Beara, he personally thanked me to thank everyone in Bristol for all that they do in terms of that very strong partnership between two world port cities. And I have mentioned about the Disaster Emergency Committee appeal. I also mentioned in my response to the Honourable Lady for Peckham that I thought it would be constructive to hold a meeting for colleagues to update them, and I will take forward the suggestion and invite the Honourable Lady to join us.
Mike gapes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Port of Beara has a huge role in providing access to the Indian Ocean for landlocked countries, as well as the 3 countries that are specifically hit by this appalling disaster. Zambia, for example, has a lot of trade going through that port. What steps are being made to assess the implications for the region as a whole, economically, and for other countries, as well as the vital humanitarian, medical, and other assistance to the countries directly affected?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in paying tribute to his extensive knowledge of these issues, he will be aware that I alluded to some of the impacts that are already apparent in terms of access to the Port of Beara, and he rightly emphasises how important it is to neighbouring countries. And as we go through this process of assessment in terms of reopening those roads, which the House should be aware they've already been built on quite high causeways, and so there's already been an account taken of the fact that this is a flood-prone region with many rivers flowing through it. There will need to be steps taken to ensure that access to the port and that the port reopens as soon as possible, because of the dependence on the whole region on food imports and exports through that port.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's an increasing body of scientific evidence linking extreme weather to increasing carbon emissions. Could the Minister set out today what diplomatic efforts her department is doing in partnership with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, both to make the case to our partners around the world and to our own government that we need to reach our net zero carbon emissions targets sooner rather than later?
Well, he will be aware of the work that the Minister for Climate and Energy is doing in terms of having commissioned work in the UK to see how the UK can show leadership in terms of net zero, and we await what comes out of that report. He will also be aware of the UK's leadership so far in terms of our own ability to have reduced our carbon emissions very significantly. He will be aware of the programming that is being done through the International Climate Finance, which has already helped to avoid or mitigate some 10.8 million tonnes of carbon from the atmosphere. But he will also be aware that we are leading through our international networks. I mentioned the uplift in terms of our new approach to climate in Africa, but also the fact that at the United Nations we will be convening the international community to deal with this all-important issue of resilience.
Joe Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our hearts go out to the hundreds of thousands of people across Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe who have been affected by this terrible disaster. And it does remind us of the huge need to focus on the fight against climate change. Now, I welcome what the Minister says about how important that is, but I would just say to her that the DFID departmental plan used to list climate change as a standalone strategic priority, and the current version does not. So in this time of climate emergency, is that not a case of getting our priorities wrong? We should be increasing the urgency of the action we take to fight climate change, not downgrading it to a subheading.
Well, I can reassure the Honourable Lady that, of course, since it is a major threat to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, tackling climate change is a strategic priority for the Department for International Development. We work across government with both BEIS and with the Department for the Environment on this, and I'm glad that the independent ICAI report said that UK international climate finance shows a convincing approach with some good emerging results in terms of influencing others and has made some good strategic choices.
Jane Ryan.
Mr. Speaker, we hear reports that aid trucks are stuck on impassable roads and that conditions are limiting air operations. And bearing in mind what the Right Honourable Gentleman for Sutton Coldfield said about the slowness of this response in comparison to some other disasters, what discussions are taking place to overcome these problems? I hear what the Honourable Lady says about the pre-deployment pacts, but I think in the, over the next coming days and weeks, this transport issue, particularly in southern Africa, is always a problem every time there is an environmental or a health disaster. So what short-term and longer-term measures are the government looking at, or the department looking at?
Well, I really do take issue, Mr. Speaker, at the criticism that this has been slow. In fact, we were in advance of the cyclone in terms of pre-positioning what was needed to relieve the situation. But the facts are that it continues to rain very, very heavily, and the facts are that a lot of the access, both by air, by water and by road, is severely hampered, and this is something that it will be difficult to overcome and indeed is at the forefront of the work that the teams on the ground are doing in terms of the logistics support that we have provided to this operation.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do welcome what the Minister has said. As she knows, I chair the all-party parliamentary group on deaths abroad and consular services, and of course the focus right now is on humanitarian aid. But can she say a little about what she can do to support constituents like mine? I have a small Malawian community in my Livingston constituency who may be affected by this in terms of family or friends, those who may want to travel back, or indeed any British nationals who may have been caught up in this horrendous disaster. Also, can she talk a little bit about any work that will be done with local communities? We will all have local church groups, local community groups who will want to help fundraise and want to help support the people of Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. What will be done to make sure that grassroots community organisations in our constituencies can also contribute to support?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank her for her work on the all-party parliamentary group on deaths abroad, but also thank everyone in Scotland and everyone in the UK for what will no doubt be a very generous response to the upcoming emergency that will be declared. And can I also highlight the announcement my Secretary of State made earlier this week in terms of making the small charities window an easier one for small charities across the UK to access. But there have been a number of different requests, Mr. Speaker, for a further update when colleagues have had the chance to hear from their constituents who may have strong links into Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. And what I would like to commit to the House, Mr. Speaker, is to organise next Monday an event where colleagues can then have taken all of the casework that's come in from their constituencies and hold a session for all colleagues.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question, Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union if he will outline what checks the House of Commons has over the powers of the joint committee contained in the proposed EU withdrawal agreement.
Minister Kwasi-Kwarteng. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As is common in international agreements, the withdrawal agreement provides for a joint committee comprising representatives of the UK and the EU to govern the implementation and application of the withdrawal agreement. The joint committee will have the powers listed in Article 164 of the agreement to ensure both parties are able to discuss any issues that may arise concerning the management and operation of the withdrawal agreement. As set out in paragraph 3 of Article 166, the Joint Committee will make all its decisions and recommendations by, I quote, mutual consent of the parties. In other words, it cannot act if the UK does not agree. This is an important protection, Mr. Speaker, for the UK, which honourable and right honourable members should welcome. Clearly, Parliament will expect that it will be able to undertake scrutiny of the work of the Joint Committee, as indeed will the European Parliament. Quite how that will operate is something which the Government will discuss with members of this House and the other place, should this House give its support to the withdrawal agreement. But this House should be in no doubt. The Government's approach at the Joint Committee will be underpinned by full ministerial accountability to Parliament.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question today, as the Prime Minister is now due to attend the critical European Council tomorrow and Friday. However, despite the imminence of these crucial negotiations, very few members of Parliament in this House are, I believe, sir, even aware of the extensive powers of an EU-UK joint committee contained within the withdrawal agreement. And I think it's very important, sir, that these are brought to the attention of the House before the Prime Minister attends the Council tomorrow, hence my request this morning. The Joint Committee is designed to oversee all aspects of the operation of the agreement and, crucially, for managing and supervising the implementation and operation of the future relationship as well. Its potentially wide-ranging powers are contained in Articles 164 to 166 of the Withdrawal Agreement and its rules of procedure, which themselves are an integral part of the treaty and are found at Annex 8, almost literally at the back of the 585-page document. There is, in fairness, an Annex 9. The decisions of the committee have full force in international law, equivalent to the treaty itself, as guaranteed in Article 166. The committee can meet in private, does not have to publish its agenda, does not have to publish any minutes, or even a summary of its minutes, and can be chaired by 2 unelected civil servants nominated by either side rather than by ministers. Under its rules of procedure, the 2 co-chairmen, acting outside of normal meetings, can even make legally binding decisions in its name by an exchange of notes, without any recourse to or consent from Parliament. Rule 9 of the Rules and Procedures clearly states on page 565 of the treaty, and I quote from it directly, sir, Rule 9, Decisions and Recommendations, 1. In the period between meetings, the Joint Committee may adopt decisions or recommendations by written procedure, if the co-chairs decide to use this procedure. The written procedure shall consist of an exchange of notes between the co-chairs. 2. Where the Joint Committee adopts decisions or recommendations, the decision or recommendation, respectively, shall be inserted in the title of such acts. The Secretariat shall record any decision or recommendation under a serial number and with a reference to the date of its adoption. Mr. Speaker, that is almost exactly the same procedure for notifying and recording EU directives and regulations. Despite all of this, the committee has hardly ever been mentioned in Parliament, and few ministers have ever referred to it directly throughout the extensive debates that we have had during this session on the whole issue of Brexit in the round. Crucially, the Joint Committee is contained within the treaty and therefore has the force of international law behind it, sir, but is outside of the backstop, which is perhaps why it's received less attention than other aspects of the withdrawal agreement to date. I believe this has been extremely cleverly drafted to hand control of future elements of this country's destiny deliberately to unelected civil servants rather than to ministers, civil servants who are unanswerable to this House of Commons in a way that ministers are. And they thought of everything, Mr. Speaker. As Rule 12 of Annex 8 is entitled expenses. And it even lays out how they can claim their expenses as well. At present, Parliament seems blissfully unaware of the ability of the Joint Committee to take legally binding decisions relating to any future aspect of the treaty or the future relationship effectively above Parliament's head. There are clear issues of accountability to Parliament, which, as far as I'm aware, have never been debated in the House at all. So I ask the Minister, can he confirm that everything I have said is true? And if any of it is not true, could he point out where and why? And therefore, could he explain, if it is true, which it is, what checks and balances this House has over the operation of the committee? In summary, Mr. Speaker, the Joint Committee contained within the draft withdrawal agreement, thank you, Bishop, the Joint Committee contained within the draft withdrawal agreement has hardly ever been discussed in the House of Commons or the media, despite the fact that it gives potentially to unelected civil servants the power to make decisions which are binding in international law by an exchange of notes without knowledge, let alone the consent, sir, of this House. If we are to approve the withdrawal agreement, we approve this procedure too, which is why it's so important we should know about it. I believe, sir, that these facts must be exposed for debate in this House before the Prime Minister departs for the Council tomorrow, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for granting the urgent question, and I look forward, I am intrigued to hear the Minister's reply.
Thank you. My right honourable friend asked me which bits of what he said I agreed with or were true, and which I thought were not true. Clearly, I agree with some of the things he said, and I think some of the things he said were slightly off the mark. The assumption underlying his question, as it seemed to me, was that the joint agreement was joint committee, was some subterranean plot, wire pullers, an attempt to somehow subvert the will of this House or subvert our democracy. He will understand, as will the House, that the structure of a joint committee is very common in international agreements. An international agreement with two parties has to have a point of arbitration, and the joint committee, comprising representatives of the UK and the EU, it's separate to the arbitration panel, that's true, but it will decide and govern the implementation and application of the withdrawal agreement. This is entirely in keeping with what happens in international treaties. I would also suggest, if he does not insist on heckling me, I will also suggest that the key part of all of this is point 3 of Article 166, which refers to mutual consent. The Joint Committee simply cannot act if the UK does not agree. And on that point, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the UK government's relationship with this Parliament, there will be full and ample opportunity, as we have done in the last 4 months, Mr. Speaker, to debate provisions or recommendations of the Joint Committee. I'd like to stress in my final part of the answer to my honourable friend that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister herself, has spent no less than 20 hours at this dispatch box in the last 4 months. So there's full and ample range of debate and discussion.
Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. I congratulate the right honourable gentleman, the member for Rayleigh and Wickford, for securing it. Mr. Speaker, the Joint Committee has attracted a significant degree of attention over recent weeks in relation to its role in the operation of the Northern Ireland backstop. But as the right honourable gentleman made clear, it's important to remember that the Joint Committee and its specialised subcommittees are also responsible for the application and implementation of the entire withdrawal agreement. And under Article 166, subsection 2, any decisions made by the Joint Committee would have, and I quote, the same legal effect as the entire withdrawal agreement. So I think the right honourable gentleman has done this House a service in providing us an opportunity to more carefully scrutinise this important part of the agreement and to seek reassurances about the role of Parliament in overseeing its operation. And to that end, can I ask the Minister the following questions relating to the role of this House in scrutinising the work of the Joint Committee, should the deal ever be approved? First, will the Government commit now to making a statement to this House before and after each and every meeting of the Joint Committee and to make all of its documents available to members? Second, what plans, if any, do the Government have to create a dedicated committee of the House to oversee the withdrawal agreement, including the Joint Committee? Third, the withdrawal agreement makes clear that the Joint Committee will be made up of representatives of the United Kingdom and the European Union. What role do the Government foresee Parliament having in the appointment of the UK representatives? Fourth, is it the Government's intention that the UK representatives include individuals from the main political parties, as well as those from devolved governments and assemblies? And finally, Mr. Speaker, in relation specifically to the Northern Ireland Protocol, could the Minister confirm that it's the Government's view that an indefinite application of the backstop would not constitute an unforeseen situation under Article 164, subsection 5D, in such a way as might provide for amendment to the treaty itself? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister. With regard to that list of questions, it would be absolutely customary and right for the Government and Minister to make a statement when the Joint Committee had opined or made recommendations. That's absolutely in order. With regard to the committee, the honourable gentleman's requests about a committee, that's a matter for the House. That's a matter for the House. It's not a matter for the executive to decide what committees of this House can be formed or not. With respect to the DAs, we have ample and very full discussions with the DAs, and of course they will be involved in aspects of the Joint Committee's decisions, particularly, I would say, in regard to the question of Ireland and the backstop. There's no way in which, and it's carefully documented in the withdrawal agreement itself, there's no way in which the Joint Committee would be making statements or recommendations with respect to the backstop or any other matters relating to Ireland without, on our part, some representation and involvement of the Northern Ireland government. So on that question, I can assure him that there will be ample consultation and involvement of the Northern Ireland Assembly.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend for achieving this urgent question, and you, Mr. Speaker, for granting it. Can I just, with respect to my right honourable friend on the front bench, ask him very simply this particular point, which was given by my right honourable friend and by the spokesman for the opposition, with regards to situations unforeseen when this agreement was signed. Who decides what is unforeseen?
Well, with regard to that specific question, the Joint Committee will have a role in suggesting what hasn't been foreseen. I mean, this is a very hypothetical question. And what I find so extraordinary, Mr. Speaker, in this whole episode, is that all of this is contingent on the withdrawal agreement being passed. All of this is contingent on the withdrawal agreement being passed. Yet my honourable friends who are asking this question have consistently voted against the agreement. So it seems very bizarre to me that the point, Mr. Speaker, is that there is no way, and my right honourable friend's question suggested or seemed to imply that this was some sort of mystical plot, as I say, to undermine the democratic process of this House. The Joint Committee will not be doing that. The British government will be in wide consultation with the House, will have ample room for debate, and everything will be done with the utmost transparency.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the right honourable member for Rayleigh and Wickford for submitting this question? I share some of his concerns, although I have to say that listening to his horror story of all the evils of the way this committee will operate, 90% of it applies to the workings of the British Cabinet, and about 99% of it applies to the way that international trade deals will be negotiated on our behalf without our knowledge or consent in the brave new world that he seeks to achieve after Brexit. But on the question of accountability and openness, I appreciate that parts of the agreement would insist on confidentiality in some circumstances. But can the Minister give an assurance that the UK Government will publish and lay before Parliament as much about the workings of the committee and as soon as possible as is permitted under the agreement? Can he also answer the question that he didn't answer from the right honourable member on the opposition front bench? Everyone now knows it was a mistake to exclude the devolved administrations and other people with potential skills from the Brexit negotiations. Everyone now knows it was a mistake not to ask for views and support from across the House much earlier on in the process. Will the Minister give an undertaking that the United Kingdom delegation to this vitally important and exceptionally powerful committee will properly reflect the political and social diversity of these nations, and that in particular when they're looking at items that are within the devolved competencies of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that the governments of those nations will be properly represented as part of the negotiating team and not simply left in a side meeting to be told what's been decided on our behalf afterwards?
The point I want to clarify is that the Joint Committee is not a negotiating team. There's no scope within the Joint Committee for some form of delegation or negotiating team. It's a committee whose sole function is to make sure that the terms of the withdrawal agreement are complied with. And in terms of the workings of the committee, as my right honourable friend has so ably enunciated, all of that is found in Annex 8 of the agreement. Annex 8 is some 20-25 pages, very carefully setting out how this committee will work.
Sir John Redwood.
Why does the government think it acceptable that any legal dispute about European law would be resolved by a decision of the European Court of Justice, a court to one of the two parties to the agreement, given that practically every legal dispute would be about a matter of European law, because both parties would still be under very comprehensive European law?
So there were two stages to this process. There's clearly the period after the end of the implementation period, in which case the CJEU will be deciding matters of EU law. Within the implementation period, as my right honourable friend knows, we will be as a member state. This is what the implementation period means. So within the implementation period, the matters of EU law, as he has suggested, will be judiciable or decided by the court. After that, their powers are restricted only to matters of EU law which we would be outside. So that's the position as very clearly set out in the withdrawal agreement.
Chris Bryant.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know about you, but it feels to me as if all of this sorry saga proves that basically the Conservative Party is now entirely run by the ERG, and it puts me in mind of a limerick which was much repeated in the 1930s. There was a young lady of Riga who went for a ride on a tiger. They came back from the ride with the lady inside and a smile on the face of the tiger. Basically, the Prime Minister has tried to ride the ERG tiger for all these years, and frankly, she's now inside the tiger, isn't she?
Well, I can assure the right honourable gentleman that I haven't been consumed by a tiger. I'm still smiling. I think that if we get this deal through the House, I look forward to his support in that. We will be able to have left the EU and be able to move forward, I hope, in a progressive and very measured way. But thank you. I thank him very much for his poetic interjections.
Mrs. Theresa Villiers.
I take the Minister's point about this structure being used in a number of contexts in international treaties, and many of my constituents would say it's still not acceptable, they'd still like to see more transparency. But even assuming this structure is acceptable in the context of some international treaties, I think, what is his response to the comment that this is a uniquely powerful treaty were it to be adopted, because it would involve this country and
consent. So that's the key element answering his question. There is no way that the Joint Committee unilaterally can impose fines on us which we ourselves have not agreed to. And I would stress that we have done in the past. We've been very successful. We have been very successful. We have been very successful, thank you, in restricting payments when we needed to. And there's no fear, there's no reason to suppose that this committee will have these swingeing penalties that we would be forced to pay without our own consent and say-so.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been drawn to the Minister's attention, under Article 174, if the arbitration panel above this joint committee can't agree on a matter of law, it has to be referred to the Court of Justice of the European Union. Doesn't this confirm that the Prime Minister has been prepared to relax at least one of her red lines to enable continuing binding rulings from the Court of Justice after we've left the European Union? And doesn't that show that it would be possible for her to relax other red lines to try and get us out of the mess that we're currently in?
I have to say I disagree with the Honourable Lady because the terms of the withdrawal agreement largely relate to the implementation period, and I have to remind the House that during the implementation period, technically we will be a member state. Once that is over, during the implementation period, that is the case. After the implementation period, the CJU will have some role in interpreting EU law, but we will be outside its jurisdiction.
Steve Baker.
Just further to my right honourable friend for North Shropshire's question, and since we are treating of matters which are both controversial and complex, can I invite my honourable friend to commit today, since he must, if he's going to do it, to lay papers, letters and other papers in the Commons Library by the rising of the House tomorrow, setting out what the government knows the committee shall be able to do and shall not be able to do, so that, and the authority for that statement, so that we can all be perfectly clear what the scope and authority of this committee is in the government's view. Thank you.
To say to my honourable friend that the scope, the rules, the jurisdiction, if you like, the powers of the Joint Committee are very ably set out in the withdrawal agreement, and I suggest that he peruses those once again.
Stephen Givens.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for securing the question, and also the concern that he shows for unelected bureaucrats, because of course we sit in a parliament where more than half of parliamentarians are unelected bureaucrats. So will the Minister possibly tell us what role the fully elected European Parliament will play in this committee?
Well, that's obviously up to them to decide how they would conduct matters with respect to their portion, their delegates, or within the Joint Committee.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Mr. Speaker, can I return to the question raised by my right honourable friend for Chipping Barnet to contest my honourable friend's rather doubtful assertion that this is normal for an international treaty, because I don't know of any other international treaty where one of the signing parties is submitting to a lawmaking power by the other, and the laws will be made in a joint committee that can sit in secret, and any matters of dispute will be referred to the court of the other party. Can he give any examples of an international treaty of this nature where these arrangements exist, and where the laws being made have are directly applicable and have direct effect in the domestic law of only one of the states?
What I would say to my honourable friend in respect of his question is that we were in the EU for 46 years. So during that time, we were absolutely 100% and totally under the jurisdiction of the EU. What the withdrawal agreement is seeking to do is to essentially get a tunnel, a pipe, away from that jurisdiction into a situation where we have left the EU absolutely. Now, in that circumstance, that's a wholly, my own understanding is that this is a wholly unique set of circumstances. And in that respect, what the withdrawal agreement seeks to do is to be a transitional agreement. It's trying to get from state A to state B. And so it's understandable that we're not going to be able to get immediate freedom, if that's what he wants to, how he would put it. But I think the withdrawal agreement substantially gets us from one state to another, and if it is endorsed, I think we will be able to proceed in an orderly way out of the EU.
Martin Whitfield.
For Mr. Speaker. The Minister has spoken about mutual consent, and where there's mutual consent, there's never any problems. The problems come when that mutuality of consent breaks down. Surely, with the joint committee, where that mutuality of consent breaks down, is it not correct that the final arbiter will be the Court of Justice of the European Union, irrespective of why the arguments arise?
I would say to his question that refers to circumstances which relate to EU law. Now, there'll be other points of dispute which do not involve EU law. And it's clear that after the end of the implementation period, the court's jurisdiction will be restricted.
There is nothing disorderly, but I must say that I am saddened to see the honourable gentleman, the member for North East Somerset, holding, until he just put it away in his pocket, his mobile telephone. I have long been conscious that the honourable member possesses and indeed uses such a mobile phone. However, it does conflict very, very, very heavily with my image of the honourable gentleman as the embodiment of tradition and as someone who thinks that the 17th century is indecently recent. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Mr. Speaker, regrettably, I was explaining why I was delayed for an appointment at 2 o'clock, so I would have the pleasure of being in the chamber to listen to this important, urgent question. So my apologies for being unduly modern. I hope, Mr. Speaker, you will follow in my footsteps of antiquity as a general rule. But to come to the gist of the question, Mr. Speaker, I wonder whether it is correct that this joint committee is subject to Article 4 of the treaty, which means that any rulings it provides are senior law in the United Kingdom, and therefore it could override statute law, making Henry VIII powers, which have been a matter of some controversy in this House, seem relatively minor.
I mean, obviously, this is a rather circular point, because Article 4 essentially is the conduit pipe, if you like, through which the provisions of the withdrawal agreement would come into UK law. Now, if there is a dispute about, and the point of the Joint Committee is to look at the implementation of the Withdrawal Act. So there really shouldn't be a conflict between Article 4 and the Joint Committee. But as I say, if there is a dispute, that would have to be resolved within the Joint Committee, and as far as the British government is concerned, there will be ample consultation, debate, questions in this House.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Sir, scrutiny is always welcome, but I have to say that I do believe this urgent question is driven less by urgency and more by a desire on behalf of the honourable gentleman for Raleigh and Wickford to continue his deeply unattractive and frankly tin-pot tyrant-like attacks on civil servants. Will the Minister deprecate those attacks on civil servants? And can he also clarify, in terms of the oversight of the Joint Committee, what the enhanced role for the devolved nations looks like in that respect that the Prime Minister promised at that box just a few weeks ago?
On his first point, I would like to say and put on record that we have an extremely fine professional body of civil servants. I think that's undisputed in this House. On the second point, as I've said on a number of occasions, we hope and we expect to have full involvement and full engagement with the devolved administrations.
Mr. David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Annex 8 of the withdrawal agreement provides that the Joint Committee will be co-chaired by a representative of the by a member of the European Commission and a minister of the British government, or alternately a high-level official. Given the hugely important role that this committee will play in the governance of this country, does my honourable friend not agree that, so far as the British side is concerned, the chairman or chairwoman should always be a minister rather than an official, so that he or she is answerable to this House? And is he prepared to give an undertaking to the House today that that will always be the case if, of course, the withdrawal agreement is ever concluded?
It is absolutely the intention of this government to have a ministerial responsibility, ministerial attendance at meetings of the Joint Committee, and we fully envisage that that will be the case.
That's what it says. Mr. Andrew Bridgen.
I press my honourable friend, the Minister, further to his earlier answer to my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. The Joint Committee will make legal decisions in unforeseen circumstances. Can he confirm that is in fact that the Joint Committee will itself decide what circumstances are unforeseen?
I have to say once again that I think all of my colleagues, my honourable and right honourable friends, have a very full confidence in our civil service. But with regard to his question, yeah, the Joint Committee will decide, will have a view on what circumstances are foreseen or unforeseen. But I have to attack this point. I have to address this point. The Joint Committee's purpose is not to hoodwink or in any way subvert what we do as a democracy in this House. And it's the government's full intention to engage extremely attentively to opinion in this House.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Can I be on it for a fresh approach, and I won't bang on?
I admire his brevity and succinctness.
Well, I very gently say to the Minister, I'm sure the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for New Forest West will regard it as the encomium of all encomiums to be paid tribute to by the junior minister. And he may well feel so uplifted by the tribute that he wishes to have it framed. However, the tribute does suffer from one notable disadvantage, and that is that despite its generosity, it offered no answer to the question.
It was short. It was brief.
Mr. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has referred a number of times to the devolved administrations, but he will be aware that the Northern Ireland Assembly has not sat for over 2 years. So how does he think that the Joint Committee will take note of the thoughts coming from the province when that is the case, on what is, of course, one of the big issues of the whole agreement?
To say to my honourable friend, we fully anticipate and hope that the Assembly will be restored. But in the absence of its restoration, we will engage, as we have done, with all political opinion across Northern Ireland in order to make sure that their representation, their feelings are reflected in the decisions of the Joint Committee.
Luke Graham.
Mr. Speaker, can my honourable friend just confirm what he said earlier in the fact that any decision-making of the Joint Committee will be subject to ministerial oversight and thus democratically accountable in this place? And secondly, he talks about engagement with the devolved nations. Can he confirm this engagement, specifically on reserve matters, will take place through the MPs that represent those constituencies in this place?
I'd like to say, so with regard to the Joint Committee, if we look at if we assume that the implementation period lasts to the end of the 2020, which is what is described, set forth in the agreement, ministerial involvement will certainly take place. Ministers will be involved in, I suspect, every meeting of the Joint Committee. With regard to devolved matters, he, I know in another capacity, is an extremely active MP, represents the interests of his constituents, and he and others and other colleagues across the House will be fully engaged in devolved matters, as has already been the case.
Mr. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and very well done for granting this urgent question. I've been really concerned about this matter for a long time, actually, and I want to talk about the mutual consent which is in Article 166. Effectively, that gives, in certain circumstances, the EU a hard veto over what the decisions are. And the Minister said that no negotiation was planned, but what we know is that the customs procedure that's embedded within the plans for a backstop, should we not be able to agree another subsequent agreement, is admitted by the UK government and the EU to be unworkable in its current form. It is non-compliant with the Union Customs Code, and it is incomplete as to matters like what happens to VAT at our borders, what happens with the export declarations. But the customs procedure itself does specify that unilateral measures can be taken by the EU should it not be satisfied with that procedure. Now, the whole point is that these matters and the rectification of these matters are fundamental to the collection of taxes at our borders. And there is no way in the world that we as a House should ever contemplate giving power over how they are changed, as this provision does, to the EU.
A right honourable friend is quite right to say that the EU may have a veto, but just as the mutual consent phrase gives them a veto, it also gives us, it also gives the UK government a veto on such decisions. Now, with regard to some of the things he mentioned, he talked about VAT. A lot of the things that he was talking about, in my understanding, refers to phase 2 of the negotiations, where there will be, I hope, one hopes, a more comprehensive free trade agreement. That's the goal, the ultimate goal, to which we are tending.
THERESA May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For 5 years from 2010, I was a member of the European Scrutiny Committee, where on a weekly basis we went through reams of directives coming from the European Union. One of the reasons why many of my constituents said that they voted by majority to leave the EU was the lack of transparency and accountability of that bloc. To continue the theme of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Rhondda, on big cats, a leopard doesn't change its spots. I don't think the EU will, and therefore can he commit to having a statement, if the withdrawal agreement goes through and this joint committee is constituted, a commitment that we will have a statement at the dispatch box from a minister after every meeting of that committee?
My understanding is that the government will have a full and as transparent as possible engagement with this House in respect to decisions and meetings of the joint committee. That is my understanding. And I look forward to his participation in further scrutiny committees when we have got the agreement through the House and when the joint committee sits.
Order. I'm most grateful to the Minister and to colleagues. Urgent question, Mr. John Bercow.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question. I ask the Minister to make a statement on no-deal Brexit preparations.
Minister Chris Heaton-Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his urgent question and congratulate him on securing your approval for it. The government has always been clear that leaving the European Union without a deal is not an outcome that we want. Last week, Parliament voted against leaving with no deal, signalling a clear majority against this outcome. However, the legal default is that the UK will leave the EU without a deal unless an alternative is agreed. Any agreed extension does not change this fact. As well as not changing this fact, a longer extension would entail the holding of European Parliament elections in the UK, and as the Prime Minister has stated in her letter to Donald Tusk, we do not believe that it would be in either of the UK or the EU's interests for the UK to hold these elections. Therefore, as a... it's a UQ. It's a UQ.
Order. I don't wish to be unkind to the honourable lady, for whom I have the highest regard. This is an urgent question. The Minister... Stop the clock, please. No. Well, the honourable lady graced the front bench with considerable distinction. And it is some time since she sat on the back bench, and it's entirely understandable she didn't know the procedure. But there is no scope for intervention when the Minister is delivering his mercifully brief oration. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologise to my honourable friend. The government has undertaken specific action to prepare for a potential no-deal scenario. We have published 450 pieces of no-deal communication since October 2018, including information on reciprocal healthcare arrangements with the EU, driving in the EU after EU exit, and even how to take your pet abroad. Contacted 150,000 businesses who trade with the EU to help them get ready for no-deal customs procedures. Held meetings, briefings and events with stakeholders across the economy, including around 300 engagements in the last month alone. Responded to stakeholder feedback to make sure communications are clear by updating around 1,300 pieces of gov.uk content based on input. More than 11,000 people working on EU exit policy and programmes are working on them across government, and we've launched a public information campaign, including information on gov.uk, to help citizens and businesses prepare for leaving the European Union. TV adverts, Mr. Speaker, started today, whilst radio, press and outdoor poster advertising are ongoing. Furthermore, the Treasury has provided £4.2 billion for EU exit preparations, including for a no-deal scenario, and the Home Office has been allocated £480 million to ensure it is fully prepared. Getting ready for this scenario depends not only on government action, Mr. Speaker, but also on action from a range of third parties, including businesses, individual citizens and the European Union itself. Despite government mitigation, the impact of a no-deal scenario is expected to be significant in a number of areas. Leaving the European Union with no deal is the legal default until Parliament passes a deal or agrees on an alternative. We are focused on achieving that, but until it has been achieved, we will continue to prepare for no deal and will advise businesses to do the same.
John Barron.
I very much thank my right honourable friend for that response. And I think it is important that the government recognises the current position. Whatever the possibilities of how people may vote in this place or what the EU may respond to requests of extensions, the Minister is absolutely right to suggest that the current legal default position is that the United Kingdom will be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March with or without a deal. And I think it is important that the front bench recognise this in more than one sense, because the narrative that seems to be emerging from number 10 is that Parliament has not expressed its view as to what it wants. Well, I would suggest to the Minister that it actually has. By a majority of 384 back in February 2017, the House clearly said that with or without a deal, we will be leaving on the 29th of March 2019. There was no equivocation about that. It was in black and white. Now, the government has said that it's making adequate preparations, Mr. Speaker. Many of us on these benches, and indeed honourable members on the benches opposite, have questioned the government about those preparations. We know that billions of pounds have been spent. We've had assurances from government, from the dispatch box, and indeed in committee. I asked the Prime Minister on the 12th of February, and I quote, "Can she reassure the House that should we leave on the 29th of March on no-deal WTO terms, we are sufficiently prepared?" She answered very directly, "We are indeed. We have ramped up our preparations. We are continuing our preparations for no deal." Now, the reason I raise this UQ, Mr. Speaker, is that reports in the media, and indeed some reports emanating from this place, suggesting that a no-deal Brexit will prove a profound economic shock, mirror the incorrect warnings before the 2016 referendum, and are causing, and this is the important point for members to appreciate in this place, as we sit in this Westminster bubble, that these pronouncements are causing concern across the country. And it's very easy for members opposite to say, oh, don't worry about it. But actually, for a lot of people sitting in their homes, these dire predictions of economic gloom, which are unfounded, are causing concerns. And I would remind the Minister that prior to the 2016 EU referendum, Mr. Speaker, there were dire predictions of 500,000 extra unemployed, which proved unfounded, so much so that the Bank of England had to apologise, amongst others. We've had record low unemployment, record manufacturing output, and record inward investment. And I suggest economic reality trumps predictions any time. So in order, Mr. Speaker, to reassure the public and to make sure that the public is better informed, will the Minister detail to Parliament the extensive preparations the Government has made for a no-deal exit, especially given the proximity to the 29th of March, just a week away? The Government needs to reassure people that we are prepared. The Government has spent 2 years preparing, has spent billions of pounds preparing, and I look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. I found it quite interesting that he was being barracked for pointing out how strong our country's economy is by the other side of this House. I thought they would be proud in those matters. To just give him I hoped in my opening statement I gave a sense of the statement of fact on where preparations are at and a sense of how much preparation government has been doing for since actually August 2016. It's been ramped up obviously in the last few months, but as I mentioned, anything from well, there is a let me list a handful of points just to make the point. Again, there are over 550 no-deal communications that have been sent out since August 2018. We made 300 stakeholder engagements since February. We've been signing international agreements with our trading partners and rolling over others. There are 11,000 people working on EU exit policy and programmes across government. A number of IT programmes are ready to go should we need to activate them. We've published the HMRC Partnership Pack containing more than 100 pages of guidance for businesses on processes and procedures at the border in a no-deal scenario. The government has been preparing assiduously and quietly behind the scenes, Mr. Speaker, for no deal. Assiduously and quietly because we want to get a deal over the line, and that is the most important thing for us.
Which side? Which side? Paul Bromfield.
I'm more than grateful for you giving me the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and of course for granting this urgent question. The Honourable Member for Basildon and Billericay talked about the wishes of this House, and he's right to do so. Mr. Speaker, this House has ruled out leaving the European Union without a deal twice, and it has rejected the government's deal by historic margins twice. It is simply unacceptable that the Prime Minister continues to go on doggedly, pressing ahead with her Hobson's choice of her deal or no deal. Resilience is an admirable quality. Obstinacy is not. So does the Minister recognise that by its approach the government risks being considered in contempt of the House yet again? Mr. Speaker, the government's energy at this critical time should be going into finding a way forward that would command the support of the House and of the country. And that is not her flawed deal that they themselves have said will shrink the economy by 4%. This requires flexibility in the government reaching out across the House, and it includes flexibility on the length and the extension of Article 50. Because as the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster said last Thursday of a 30th of June extension, and I quote, "In the absence of a deal, seeking such a short and critically one-off extension would be downright reckless and completely at odds with the position that this House has adopted." So does the Minister agree that rather than this focus on no deal, the Prime Minister's priority should now be to create opportunities for this House to consider all the options available to get the country out of the impasse that she has created?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman for his points. I think he will find there are a lot of honourable members sitting behind him who represent seats in this country that voted to leave the European Union in big number and would be surprised to hear that Her Majesty's opposition is trying to stop that from happening. Can I just say to him in a straightforward way, as I said in my statement, the legal default is that the United Kingdom will leave the European Union without a deal unless an alternative is agreed. Any agreed extension does not change this fact.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I just welcome my right honourable friend to his place? I wonder if he had noticed that literally within the last few hours, Monsieur Barnier has issued an instruction declaring that the EU must now prepare for the no-deal scenario, claiming that only two elements of their work need to be completed. One is short-term visas and the other is the budget for 2019. Does that mean, therefore, that the EU considers that if we do not reach a deal, then we will be leaving on the 29th?
I've outlined the legal default position a couple of times already. And can I also say to the honourable gentleman, I obviously, and my department does monitor exactly what the European Commission is doing in its no-deal announcements, as it does with all the individual member states. The Commission has made no-deal announcements on Erasmus, social security, fishing, air transport, aviation safety, road haulage, trade and exports, dual-use systems, EU funding for peace programme, energy efficiency, connecting Europe facilities, shipping inspection, and a whole host of other areas that does mean that the European Commission, like us, would be ready in that circumstance.
Stephen Givens.
Mr. Speaker, save what one Conservative MP referred to as the headbanger wing of the Conservative Party. Brexit is a bad idea and everybody thinks it's a bad idea. Businesses, medical personnel, universities. This Parliament voted to rule out no deal because it represents a colossal political failure. Now, the member for Basden and Billericay talked about what concerns people. I'll tell you what concerns people. A decade of Westminster austerity that's hitting schools, the NHS and other public services. So as a matter of fact, we're spending £4.2 billion on a no deal, including millions for ferries. No one voted to leave on the 29th of March. No one voted for a no deal. Will he take no deal off the table and invest the money back into hard-pressed public services?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, Mr. Speaker. I think he'll find that actually 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union, and I think a huge number of them, including in Scotland, will find his comments very disappointing. However, as I pointed out to my honourable friend and other honourable gentlemen earlier, the legal default is that the United Kingdom will leave the European Union without a deal unless an alternative is agreed.
Mr. Owen Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question by right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. Mr. Barney put out a statement yesterday saying quite correctly that voting against no deal does not prevent it from happening. And he said everyone should now finalise all preparations for a new deal scenario, pointing out the EU side, quote, "we are prepared," and are working on the two last measures that still need to be adopted, namely on short-term visas and the EU budget for 2019. My question to the Minister is, will those two issues be resolved in 11 days' time? And how many issues do you think the UK government still has outstanding?
Fortunately, whilst I was a member of the European Parliament for 10 years, I couldn't honestly comment on how quick how long it would take the European Union to complete their final two measures, although budget rounds are very interesting debates in the European Parliament. We have a number of matters that we are still finishing off in our no-deal preparations, but the vast majority are in a good state. Thank you.
Chris Bryant.
Mr. Speaker, can I just ask the Minister about security, national security, because one of the things that is undoubted is that if we leave without a deal, British police forces will no longer be able to use up-to-date information from all the other police forces in Europe, and we will no longer be able to use the present extradition arrangements within the European Union under the European arrest warrant. What is he going to put in place to make sure that we are safe?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman for his very sensible question. The continued safety and security of both UK and EU citizens remains our top priority. In a no-deal scenario, the UK would lose access to the current mechanisms we use to cooperate with EU member states on security and law enforcement. The Home Office is working intensively with operational partners to put no-deal plans into action and to ensure the UK is ready to transition our cooperation with European partners and make best use of the alternative channels with EU member states should that be required. We're preparing to move cooperation to alternative non-EU mechanisms, should that be required, and our contingency plans are largely tried and tested mechanisms which we already use for cooperating with many non-EU countries. This includes making more use of Interpol and Council of Europe conventions. They are not like-for-like replacements, however, they would result in a reduction, would result in a reduction in mutual capability.
Dr. Andrew Mearison.
We have been treated to plenty of lurid stories over the past months on the shortage of radioisotopes on which 1 million people in our NHS depend every year. Would the Minister confirm that advance plans are in place to ensure that in the event that we left the European Union with no deal, nobody will be disadvantaged?
I can confirm that we have plans for the items that he has talked about, and indeed a written ministerial statement was laid on the floor of this House, I think nearly 3 weeks ago, that gives great detail to those plans.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, if Macron, like de Gaulle before him, is going to say no to the PM's request for an extension, then we won't get one because it has to be unanimous. In that situation, does he agree with me that, as a matter of fact, the only way to avoid no deal would be to revoke Article 50, yes, which this House could do, because contrary to what the Honourable Member for Spelthorne suggested yesterday, the House has not as yet voted on a motion to revoke Article 50.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. As a matter of fact, the best route to stop that from happening is to vote for the Prime Minister's deal.
Mr. David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend has acknowledged that the default position is that this country will leave the European Union on the 29th of March without a deal. Can he say in what circumstances the government will conclude that a deal is impossible? And does he not accept the point made by the honourable member for Basildon and Billericay that the public are entitled to reassurance on this point?
Yes, I'd like to think that by the vast array of publicly available information as to how we are prepared for no deal that we have made, and indeed the ongoing advertising campaign that I detailed in my statement, we are giving some reassurance. I can also say that, in my personal view, leaving without a deal is, and I know some members of the House don't like this word, but is suboptimal. The optimal way of leaving is with a deal. That takes no deal off the table completely. We are as ready as we can be at this point, and a huge amount of information is out in the public domain that should give the reassurance to his constituents and mine that they deserve.
Yes, I think that the honourable gentleman for Huddersfield is concerned, but I think the honourable gentleman is back in the chamber, and I think he was. I don't think that I need to dwell upon the matter. Suffice it to say that there can, in extremis, be a reason why somebody has very, very, very briefly to leave the chamber, on the grounds that when the call of nature sounds, somebody cannot pretend to be deaf. And I don't say that in a pejorative spirit. I simply mean that one cannot pretend not to be aware of the immediate requirement.
I was relieving myself, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, well...
Sorry.
I was trying to signal as much in a somewhat more tactful and seemly manner, but the honourable gentleman now blurted out the truth, and the nation is aware of what was his requirement. But as he's now come back into the chamber, he can beetle back to his seat and listen to the remainder of the exchange.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Well done. Now, Catherine West.
Speaker, I understand it's estimated that the cost of Brexit is 500 million per week. Does this include the cost of school meals, hospital meals and home meals, as in social care settings?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I don't recognise that figure one bit.
Well done. Mr. Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister will know, it's now being widely reported on Twitter that President Macron is minded to veto any extension of Article 50 at the Council tomorrow. if that should occur, can the Minister confirm that the DEXU Secretary is going to initiate Operation Yellowhammer, which is the government's no-deal plan, on Monday? And if that is so, and there is no extension, why don't we just vote down the rancid withdrawal agreement and sprint for the line?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will not expect me to comment on whether or not the President of France is active on Twitter at this point in time. However, and he and I do disagree on one fundamental point here, because I, having been involved in European negotiations in the past of a much more minor nature than anything like this, know that occasionally there are times to bank what you have got. But he disagrees with me on this point, and that's it's a principled disagreement. But we do have a project, Yellowhammer, which we're working to deliver, which is essentially working to deliver the biggest peacetime project in the history of the civil service. Leaving the European Union with a deal remains the government's top priority. However, a responsible government must plan for every eventuality, including leaving with a no-deal scenario, and these preparations are taking place alongside work to deliver on the government's policy priorities.
Tom Brake.
Speaker, it's essential that the largest businesses and indeed the trade associations that depend on them for information about the progress that's being made on the rollover trade deals are kept fully informed. Can the Minister explain why the Department for International Trade stopped the round tables with large businesses?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, I didn't know they had, but I know that there are ongoing engagements with business representative organisations across the whole of government, including some that I've attended myself very recently.
Sir Desmond Swain.
It'd be stupid to go out panic buying, wouldn't it?
Yes.
The Honourable Gentleman, the member for Huddersfield, seems gravely perturbed that the fact that he's seated behind the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Chesterfield, will disadvantage him. But what I would say to the Honourable Member for Huddersfield is I can almost always see him, and even if I can't see him, I can absolutely certainly hear him. So he's nothing to worry about at all. Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, I'm usually an optimist. Can I tell the Minister I'm usually an optimist? But I don't know if the Minister shares this with me, a feeling of dread and doom today. Here we are in the greatest national crisis for 100 years, with the Titanic steaming towards the iceberg. And he's a nice man, but he's a parliamentary under-secretary being sent to reassure the House that the preparations all are in good order. Can I say to him, even at this late stage, we can go to Europe and ask for a longer rather than a shorter extension. We can also listen to the voice of reason behind him, the Right Honourable Member, the Father of the House, the Member for Rushcliffe, who made a very serious contribution earlier today. Surely, at this stage, he could actually speak up for the nation and say enough is enough, let us put this on hold and get a sensible relationship with Europe agreed across these benches.
I think I can stand up and speak for the nation when I say the only sense of dread and doom I have is when the honourable gentleman is ready to speak.
Mr. Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, remind my right honourable friend, the Minister, that we both stood on an election promise that no deal was better than a bad deal. But beyond that, can he confirm that there are aviation agreements in place so that planes will be flying to and from Gatwick and other UK airports on March the 30th?
Yes, I can confirm that we have signed a whole suite of aviation agreements, and that is the case.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Speaker. There's a good reason that this House has resoundingly objected and rejected a no-deal Brexit, because members here have looked at the evidence of the real-world harms, and just one of those will concern the position of healthcare for British citizens who are pensioners who've retired in countries across the European Union. The Minister will know that a reciprocal arrangement could not be made with the EU as a whole, but would have to be made with 27 individual countries. Could the Minister set out in how many of those 27 countries our fellow citizens who've retired to the European Union now have the absolute certainty that in 9 days' time they will have reciprocal healthcare arrangements in place?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. Actually, there are a whole host of countries that are now enacting legislation through their processes to do exactly as the honourable lady says. The honourable lady is completely correct in the fact that actually health in general terms is tied up within social security policy in nearly all EU member states. This needs legislation in individual EU member states. And I believe, and I will write to her later today to clarify this, but pretty much every member state has started that legislative process.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kent MPs have been meeting regularly about preparations for Brexit with the Roads Minister, Department for Transport, Highways England, Kent Police, Port of Dover and Eurotunnel. But can I ask my honourable friend, and it might be that if you can't answer this in the chamber, he could perhaps write to me, for assurances that HMRC, and particularly the customs part of HMRC, are ready for Brexit and ready for the extra volume of customs procedures that may be needed to make sure we don't have queues in Kent.
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for her question, and she quite rightly raises concerns for her constituents in this area. Extensive work to prepare for a no-deal scenario has been underway across government for 2 years, and we are taking steps at the border to ensure the border continues to operate as effectively as possible from the day we leave. We have 3 objectives for the UK border to be delivered on day 1 and beyond: maintaining security, facilitating the flow of goods and people, and revenue protection. We will prioritise flow at the border, which means any increase in the number of checks will be kept to a minimum by conducting only essential checks, which will help to reduce friction at locations like Kent.
Vernon Coker.
Speaker, can I ask the Minister, I know we've got the TV adverts today, what official advice is the government giving to families across the country as to what they should do to prepare or cope with this country exiting the EU without a deal? Keep calm and carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. It does rather depend on what aspect of people's lives will be affected, and so there is a huge range of information that is both online and now available in advertising as well, where people will be able to see if they were concerned about taking their pets abroad or wanted to change their holiday, what would happen in those circumstances, and it's all available online.
Toby Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, it's patently obvious that the government isn't remotely prepared for us to leave without a deal. And at the same time, we have a government that's ploughing on with a plan that's been twice rejected, refusing to bring votes, refusing to stick to commitments that they'd made to this House. If there was the chief executive of a major FTSE 500 company or the chief executive of a hospital who ran a major project in anything like as shambolic a way as this, every single member of Parliament would be demanding they resign. Why doesn't the Prime Minister resign?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I seem to believe that it's the leader of the opposition who didn't want to prepare for no deal in any circumstance whatsoever. Didn't want to spend any money on getting this country ready in case we were to leave without a deal. And so if anybody, I guess he's calling to resign, should be his leader of the opposition.
And Tom Pursglove.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that I still see no case to extend, but in the event of extension, does he envisage there being any further no-deal planning, or is all of that no-deal planning completed and there's nothing further to be done?
Oh no, in an extension there would be further no-deal planning, I can assure the honourable gentleman, and lots of plans would have to be adjusted because they're obviously targeted currently at one particular date, and that would obviously be moving.
Debbie Abrahams.
Of the 10,000 or so constituents that I've spoken to since the EU referendum, there are many different reasons why people voted to leave the EU. None of them included to be poorer. So given that we know all the credible economic analysis shows that the economy would shrink and there would be an increase in poverty, how is the Minister making preparations for if and when an extension to Article 50 can be quickly implemented in this House?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I didn't hear the very last bit of it, but the Treasury analysis that was, that was published by the government back in November shows that in every scenario the economy of this country will be growing.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Minister seen the call from the President of the National Farmers Union of Scotland today, asking the Government to abandon their proposals for applied tariffs in the event of a no-deal Brexit? As he points out, without the maintenance of tariff protections, we would be in danger of opening up the UK to imported food which would be illegal to be produced here. In the 1970s, his predecessors in Conservative government then regarded our fishermen as expendable. It's beginning to look as if this current government has taken the same attitude towards our farmers.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I disagree entirely. A tariff schedule which has now been published is designed to look after certain segments of the economy, including agriculture, and also. But then he then went on to talk about standards, and we are not dropping standards of what we expect in agricultural goods.
Ian Murray.
The Minister said on numerous occasions already during this urgent question that the default legal position is for the UK to leave the EU on the 29th of March next week. So can the Minister tell the House what the process is for changing the date in the EU Withdrawal Act and what day next week we will get that?
I would assume that a statutory instrument would do that particular piece of work.
Hal Williams.
Mr. Speaker, government expenditure on no-deal preparations can be expressed as a sum of £63 per person per annum for 3 years. Wales's net benefits from the EU budget is £79 per person per year. Which does the Minister consider to represent good value?
I think preparing the country for every eventuality that this Parliament has voted for is good value for money.
Paul Sweeney.
This House has unequivocally excluded the idea of no deal. It's ruled it out of hand. So for the only way to avoid that would be for the government to bring forward a meaningful vote again, which has been excluded by you, Mr. Speaker, or to prepare to revoke Article 50 or to accept crashing out with no deal. So what is the government going to be doing?
When are we getting a vote?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Honourable Gentleman. I would never presume to guess what Mr. Speaker might do in allowing different things on the floor of this House. Indeed, every day seems to be a bit of a surprise at the moment. However, the legal default is that the UK will leave the European Union without a deal unless an alternative is agreed. The alternatives are, well, I'd like to think we're going to vote, and we will vote for the deal.
Mr. Speaker.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, there really would be no need for this question if the government were to accept that no deal has already been ruled out by Parliament, and that indeed there are two ways forward from that. One would be revocation and the other would be suspension of Article 50. But can I offer another alternative to the Minister? That would be to bring back the meaningful vote next week, a very different meaningful vote that would have embedded in the approval motion the principle of a ratification of the Prime Minister's deal by the people with Remain on the ballot paper.
I think, obviously, I welcome, as the Prime Minister does, all conversations about how the meaningful vote can be passed by this House. But last week, this House did, by some big number, by more than a majority of the number of MPs in this House, reject a people's vote.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, in answer to my honourable friend for Hornsey and Wood Green, who quoted a figure of the cost of Brexit being at 500 million a week, the Minister replied that he didn't recognise that figure. The Governor of the Bank of England says the figure is actually 800 million per week. Which figure does the Minister recognise?
Well, obviously, the Governor of the Bank of England didn't recognise that figure either.
Mike Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the event of no deal next week, the Minister has rightly said we now have an aviation agreement with the European Union, which means the planes can take off and land. But what he didn't say was that includes no route expansion during that time. Manchester Airport in my constituency has 30 million passengers annually with capacity for 55 million. 74% of flights go to other EU destinations. That's a bad agreement for the people of the north of England, surely.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I know he does represent his constituents that work and need the Manchester Airport to work in his constituency very assiduously. Now, I will have to come back to the honourable gentleman because I actually believe the European Commission has moved, but I might be mistaken. I will have to go away and I'll come back to him. But I think they've said that they would allow route expansion in this coming year, but I'd have to come back to the honourable gentleman to completely clarify that point, if I may.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell me how many of the 17.4 million people who voted leave in 2016 voted for the Prime Minister's deal and how many voted for no deal? And if he can't, isn't it time that he and his government stops using the term the will of the people unless he's prepared to find out what the will of the people is by putting the deal back to the people with the option to remain?
One thing I know that over 58.9% of the constituents in my constituency voted for, and indeed the 17.4 million who voted in total, was to leave the European Union.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been a classic display of what over-promotion looks like in front of the entire House this afternoon. And no, I won't come on. This stuff from the Minister has been grimly depressing. Can he confirm that my learned friend from Edinburgh South West was 100% spot on? If the Council doesn't grant an extension, and if Parliament doesn't pass meaningful vote 3, assuming, Mr. Speaker, you allow it to come back before next Friday, revocation is the only way to stop no deal.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question and his comment. I think that kind remark will do a world of good for me on my electoral literature in my Middle England constituency next time, which voted to leave, expects the government to deliver on the wishes of its votes and expects the government to deliver on leaving the European Union. The best way to take no deal off the table is to vote for the deal.
Thank you. Order. Point of order? Yes, OK, I'll take it now. Point of order, Mr Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm most grateful for you granting this opportunity for a point of order. Mr. Speaker, we live in interesting times, if we can put it that way. We are in a constitutional crisis. And of course, we're aware that the Prime Minister is going off to Brussels tomorrow. And out of that, whether or not we're going to have an extension to Article 50 or not, we need to reflect on the fact that we are a week away from the intended departure date from the European Union. The threat from the government of no deal is very real, and we ought to be aware of the consequences of that because the government have told us the threat to the supply of medicines, the threat to food supplies, and indeed a threat to public order. Mr. Speaker, these are very serious matters. And under the circumstances that we are going to have so very few days left, I have today written to the Prime Minister and demanded that under the circumstances that this House convenes on Saturday so that we can plot a way ahead. We need to use the opportunities granted to us in those few days that are left, and indeed the opportunity that we may need to invoke of revoking Article 50 if this government is serious in taking us forward on a no-deal scenario. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask your forbearance and I ask what opportunities that you can suggest that are open to us to make sure in these times of crisis that we have the opportunity, as we did do at the time of the Suez crisis, the last disaster visited upon us by this government, to make sure that we can stand up for our constituents and make sure that we can protect our people from the catastrophe of no deal.
Hear, hear. Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his point of order. When he seeks my advice, my response to him is to say that, as I indicated to the right honourable gentleman yesterday, a Saturday sitting, or indeed for that matter a Sunday sitting, would be perfectly possible. It would, however, be possible only if there were a resolution of the House to that effect. Indeed, any change to the thus far set out, and therefore by members anticipated sittings, would require a resolution of the House. If the right honourable gentleman reflects on the point that I've made, he will be keenly conscious that such a resolution could potentially be put to the House either tomorrow or indeed for that matter on Friday, as this Friday is a sitting day. I'm not seeking to engender an expectation. I have no indication at all that the government is thinking in those terms, or that it will necessarily be sympathetic to the right honourable gentleman's request, but it would be perfectly possible in procedural terms. My advice to the right honourable gentleman is that he should await a reply to his letter. Yes, indeed. Yes. A point of order, Anna Soubry.
Further to that very good point of order from the honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker, would it be in order for all of us to be here on Saturday in the circumstances as described, given that many hundreds of thousands of people are due to march in London in support of a people's vote, many of them young people demanding a say about their future, given they'll be bearing the burden of Brexit. And Mr. Speaker, in those circumstances, would the House be able to rise to go and greet those hundreds of thousands of people who rightly want a final say on Brexit and a people's vote?
The honourable lady's point of order contains a twin, or at any rate double, hypothesis, and we shall have to wait to see. As I always say, invoking the late Willie Whitelaw, it is best to cross bridges only when you come to them. The right honourable lady's use, and some would say abuse, of the point of order procedure does display a notable, though not altogether uncharacteristic, cheekiness, a fact of which I think the right honourable lady herself is well aware, but she is nothing if not dexterous in her use of available procedures. Point of order, Mr. Barry Shearman.
Short one. He is right, of course, about having a resolution from this House in order to sit on a Saturday, but there are arrangements because of staff and much else that run this House, that can I be assured that the planning, just in case that resolution came, is in place?
Well, I think that's a very sensible point. Planning will be underway lest that scenario should arise, and not least out of consideration for the staff who serve us so loyally and so well. It is essential that that is so. They have already, in recent times, been very gravely inconvenienced as a result of our deliberations. That is the way it is, and they very graciously accept it, but we shouldn't take their loyalty for granted. They must be treated with respect. Point of order, Toby Perkins.
Speaker, anyone who heard the urgent question from the honourable gentleman from Rayleigh and all those who responded to it will know how there are many members who absolutely love and indulge themselves in long discussions about arcane matters of European legislation and different articles, and spent far less time worrying about the disastrous potential consequences of their actions. Is he aware of whether there are any plans for grief counselling for those members in the event that we left the European Union? They were no longer to spend many long hours talking about these things, and they actually spent some time concentrating about the poverty in their constituencies.
Aware of any plans for grief counselling, but my expectation would be that the right honourable gentleman, the member for Rayleigh and Wickford, would focus his beady eye on a vast range of other important topics. And I've no reason to think that he's about to contradict me, but if the Right Honourable Gentleman really insists, I feel on the strength of our 35-year acquaintance, I must indulge the Right Honourable Gentleman. Point of order.
To save the House and the country money, if we leave at 11 p.m. on the 29th, we are at D-9. I have no need or requirement for grief counselling, but I could have a whacking hangover on the morning of the 30th.
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman. It's been an afternoon in which colleagues have volunteered more personal information than is customary. Yes, a point of order, Liz Saville-Roberts.
Could you please inform me how I might best do my duty for this chamber? As leader of the Plaid Cymru parliamentary group, I have been invited to number 10 at 6:15 this evening. I have also been invited between 6 and 7 o'clock to a meeting with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. These meetings clash. I would seek his advice on how best to proceed.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Aurelian Wickford, says from a sedentary position, follow the money. Well, it's not for me to endorse or indeed to repudiate that suggestion. What I would say to the Honourable Lady is that she is clearly a much sought-after individual. And I've always regarded her as important. I know she has a very full diary. No doubt there are many competing claims upon her time. And as I say, her attendance is required by noted celebrities within the government. My advice to her is very simple. Trust your instincts and, very simply, to thine own self be true. If there are no further points of order, I shall in a moment call Keir Starmer to make an application, colleagues, for leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration under the terms of Standing Order number 24. The Right Honourable Gentleman has up to 3 minutes in which to make such an application. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing time to hear this application for an emergency debate on the following motion: that this House has considered the matter of the length and purpose of the extension of the Article 50 process requested by the Government. I do note that the SO24 procedure requires a specific and important matter to be before the House, and I think there could be few more important than this, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the House passed a motion by a majority of 210 requiring the Government to request an extension to the Article 50 process. The Prime Minister voted for that motion. The wording of the motion itself and speeches from that dispatch box, including from the Minister for the Cabinet Office, led the House to believe that the Government would seek either, on the one hand, a short technical extension if the Prime Minister's deal was passed by the 20th of March today, or a longer extension if that was not the case. Parliament could not have expected the Prime Minister instead to pursue a course described at that dispatch box by the Minister for the Cabinet Office as downright reckless. Yet today we learn that is exactly what the Prime Minister intends to do. The Prime Minister has now made a formal request to the President of the European Council for an extension of Article 50, but she's not made a statement to this House. Therefore, the only opportunity for Parliament to debate this issue before the Council meets tomorrow is by this SO24 application. It's vital that the Prime Minister and the Government are held to account on this, that we have this opportunity to scrutinise the Government's approach, to consider the terms of the extensions that are being sought, and if this approach and to ask whether this approach abides by the will expressed by the House last week. I therefore ask for this emergency debate to be held at the earliest opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. The Right Honourable Gentleman asks leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration, namely that this House has considered the matter of the length and purpose of the extension of the Article 50 process requested by the Government. I have listened carefully to the application from the Right Honourable Member, and I am satisfied that the matter raised by the Right Honourable Member is proper to be discussed under Standing Order number 24. Has the Right Honourable Gentleman the leave of the House?
No!
I say, colleagues can now resume their seats, as much for the benefit of those observing our proceedings so that they are intelligible, that there was an objection, I think, from the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Wellingborough. No, I heard it very clearly, but I think he probably wants everybody to know the Honourable Gentleman, member for Wellingborough, objected, and in those circumstances it is necessary for at least 40 Honourable or Right Honourable members to rise in their places, if you will, to validate the application. And it was very obvious to me, they can do it again if they want to, exercise their knee muscles. It is entirely obvious that the Right Honourable Gentleman has indeed obtained the leave of the House. It is commonplace for such debates to take place the following day, but it is by no means required that they should do so, and I have on a previous occasion, because of the circumstances, ruled that the debate should take place straight away. This is such a circumstance. The debate will be held today as the first item of public business, that is to say, after the 10-minute rule motion. The debate will last for up to 3 hours, and it will arise on a motion that the House has considered the specified matter set out in the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman's application. I'm grateful to him and to colleagues. Before we get to it, we have other pieces of business, relatively brief. Presentation of Bill. Geraint Davis.
Fracking, Measurement and Regulation of Impacts, Air, Water and Greenhouse Gas Emissions Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 22nd of March.
Friday the 22nd of March. Thank you. Order. 10-minute rule motion. Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Secretary of State to report on extending eligibility for the Destitution Domestic Violence concession to European Economic Area nationals and persons other than those granted immigration entry clearance as a partner and for connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, the Destitution Domestic Violence concession eligibility bill seeks to level